The screaming started at 3:17 a.m., but it wasn't human. I know because I checked my watch the moment that ungodly sound pierced through the Montana wilderness, echoing off the canyon walls like a banshee's wail. In my 15 years as a park ranger at Glacier National Park, I'd heard every sound the wilderness could make, but this was different. This was wrong. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I've spent most of my adult life in these mountains. I came here after my discharge from the Army, seeking the kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by something bigger than yourself. The park gave me that peace, at least until the night everything changed. I was stationed at the remote Bowman Lake Ranger Station, a small cabin that served as the last outpost before the true wilderness began. Most rangers dreaded the isolation, but I preferred it. No tourists asking stupid questions, no RVs clogging the roads, just me, the mountains, and the endless pine forests that stretched to the Canadian border. The screaming came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my boots. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tree line about 50 yards away. The forest was absolutely silent now, as if every living thing was holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Anyone out there need help?" Nothing. Not even the usual chorus of night sounds, no owls, no rustling leaves, no distant howl of coyotes. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I'd been getting reports all week about strange happenings in this sector. Hikers complaining about feeling watched, cameras going missing from wildlife monitoring stations, and most disturbing of all, the discovery of several animal carcasses arranged in perfect circles. The local Blackfeet Tribal Council had been asking questions too, their elders speaking in hushed tones about old stories I didn't understand. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. I found tracks around the cabin, human footprints, but wrong somehow. They were too deep, pressing into the hard earth with impossible weight, and they circled the building exactly 13 times before disappearing at the forest's edge. I radioed headquarters, but the response was static. The radio had been acting up for days, cutting out at random intervals. The satellite phone was dead too, its battery drained despite being fully charged the night before. That's when I noticed the trees. The pine grove that had stood 30 yards from my cabin for over a century was different. The trees were still there, but they'd moved. Not dramatically, just a few feet closer to the building, their branches now brushing against the roof when the wind blew. I'd walked past those trees every day for 3 years, and I knew their exact positions. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the recent storms had shifted the soil, or maybe I was just tired and misremembering. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The second night, I saw them. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind, when shadows began moving past my window. Not the ordinary shadows of swaying branches, but tall, thin figures walking upright between the trees. They moved with purpose, following some invisible path through the forest. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. The figures were still there, maybe a dozen of them, standing motionless in a rough circle around my cabin. In the moonlight, they looked like people, but people stretched too tall, their limbs extended beyond normal proportions. Their faces were pale smudges in the darkness, and when one turned toward my window, I saw that it had no features at all. My blood turned to ice water. These weren't people. They weren't even alive in any sense I understood. I fumbled for my radio, but it was completely dead. The satellite phone wouldn't even turn on. Even my flashlight flickered and died, as if something was draining the power from everything electronic. The figures began to move closer. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the rifle with sweating hands. The things outside were completely silent as they approached, their feet making no sound on the forest floor. Through the window, I could see them pressing against the glass, their blank faces inches from mine. One of them began to scratch at the window with impossibly long fingers. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, but somehow worse, it seemed to vibrate through the glass and into my bones. The other figures joined in, their claws scraping against the walls, the door, the roof. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The figures were gone, melted back into the forest like they'd never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner with my rifle, watching the windows and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I found the scratches, hundreds of them, carved deep into the wooden walls of the cabin. Some formed symbols I didn't recognize, ancient-looking markings that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly. I should have left then. I should have packed my gear and hiked out to the main road, but I couldn't abandon my post. The Park Service had protocols, and I'd signed an oath to protect this wilderness. Besides, part of me needed to understand what was happening. The third day brought visitors, a family of 4 from Minnesota, the Hendersons, who'd gotten lost on the backcountry trail. They arrived at my cabin just before sunset, exhausted and frightened. "We've been walking in circles for hours," the father, Jim, explained. "Our GPS died, and we keep ending up in the same clearings. It's like the forest is playing tricks on us." His wife, Linda, was pale and shaking. "We kept seeing things in the trees," she whispered. "Tall figures watching us. Following us." Their children, a boy and girl around 10 years old, clung to their parents. The boy, Tyler, looked up at me with wide eyes. "The tree people don't like us being here," he said. "They want us to go away." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What tree people?" "The ones who live in the forest," Tyler said matter-of-factly. "They're very tall and very old, and they don't have faces. The Hendersons needed shelter for the night, and I couldn't turn them away. I set them up in the main room while I kept watch, but I had a terrible feeling about what was coming. As darkness fell, the scratching began again. This time, it was accompanied by voices, not the screaming from the first night, but whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if the very wood was speaking. The children started crying. Linda Henderson grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my flesh. "What is that?" she demanded. "What's happening?" I tried to reassure them, but my own voice was shaking. "Stay calm," I said. "Whatever happens, don't go outside. Don't even look out the windows." But it was too late. Tyler had already pressed his face against the glass, and his scream pierced the night air. They were back, the tall figures, dozens of them now, surrounding the cabin. But this time, they weren't just standing there. They were moving, swaying back and forth in some kind of ritual dance. Their arms were raised above their heads, and their mouths were open in silent screams. "Don't look at them," I shouted, pulling Tyler away from the window. "Everyone get to the back room, now." We huddled in the small storage room, but the whispers followed us. They were coming from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The very air seemed to vibrate with their alien voices. Then the power went out. In the complete darkness, I could feel the presence of the things outside pressing against the building. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were being crushed by an enormous weight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were speaking in unison, chanting something in that unknowable language. Linda Henderson was sobbing. Her husband was trying to comfort her, but I could hear the terror in his voice too. The children had gone silent, and that scared me more than their crying. "Tyler?" I whispered. "Emma? Are you okay?" No response. I reached out in the darkness, feeling around for them, but my hands found only empty air. "Jim," I said urgently. "Where are your kids?" "They're right here," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "Tyler? Emma?" We fumbled for our flashlights, but nothing would work. Every electronic device was dead, drained of power by whatever was outside. In the absolute darkness, we could hear something moving in the main room, footsteps, but too many of them, as if an entire crowd was walking around inside the cabin. The whispers were getting louder, more urgent. They seemed to be coming from the main room now, from the very spot where we'd heard the footsteps. And underneath the alien voices, I could hear something else, children's voices, Tyler and Emma, but wrong somehow. Their words were distorted, as if they were speaking underwater. "Mom? Dad?" Emma's voice called out. "We're in here. Come find us." Linda started to get up, but I grabbed her arm. "That's not your daughter," I said. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "Of course it's Emma." "Tyler?" Jim called out. "Where are you, son?" "I'm here, Dad," came the boy's voice. "But I'm different now." "We're both different." The tree people showed us how to be like them. The voices were definitely coming from the main room, but there was something horribly wrong with them. They echoed strangely, as if they were being spoken by something that didn't quite understand how human speech worked. "Come out and see us," Tyler's voice continued. "We want to show you what we learned." I could feel Linda and Jim struggling against my grip, desperate to go to their children. But I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was calling to them wasn't human anymore. The whispers suddenly stopped, leaving us in complete silence. Even the children's voices had gone quiet. The only sound was our own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. Then, slowly, the scratching began again. But this time, it was coming from inside the storage room with us. I felt along the walls, trying to locate the source of the sound. My fingers found the scratches, fresh grooves being carved into the wood right next to where I was standing. Something was inside the wall, clawing its way through the timber. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. "Now." But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door was held shut by some invisible force. We were trapped. The scratching was getting more intense, and I could hear wood splintering as whatever was inside the wall broke through. A section of the paneling suddenly gave way, and a pale, elongated arm reached through the gap. The fingers were impossibly long, with black claws instead of nails, and they moved with a horrible, spider-like motion. Linda screamed. Jim was trying to push us all toward the far corner of the room, but there was nowhere to go. More arms were breaking through the walls now, reaching for us with those terrible claws. I fired my rifle at one of the arms, and the bullet passed right through it without effect. The arm continued reaching, grasping at the air where Linda had been standing just seconds before. "The children," I said, finally understanding. "They're using the children as bait." Whatever took Tyler and Emma, It's trying to get to you too. The arms were everywhere now, emerging from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. They moved with coordinated purpose, herding us toward the center of the room. I could smell something awful, like rotting vegetation mixed with something chemical and alien. That's when I noticed the symbols on the walls. They were the same markings I'd seen scratched into the outside of the cabin, but now they were glowing with a faint, sickly light. The arms seemed to be emerging from the symbols themselves, as if the scratches were doorways to somewhere else. The radio, I said suddenly. My emergency radio in the truck. If we can get outside. Are you insane? Jim shouted. Those things are out there. They're in here too, I pointed out. At least outside we can run. The arms were getting closer, and I could see that some of them had faces at the ends instead of hands, distorted, elongated faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They were whispering in that alien language, and the sound made my teeth ache. I made a decision. Grabbing Linda and Jim, I threw my full weight against the door. It gave way suddenly, sending us tumbling into the main room. The cabin was full of them. Dozens of the tall figures stood throughout the room, their blank faces turned toward us. They were perfectly still, like statues, but I could feel their attention focused on us with predatory intensity. Among them, I could see Tyler and Emma, or what had been Tyler and Emma. They were taller now, their limbs stretched and distorted, and their faces were becoming blank and featureless like the others. "Mom," Emma said, her voice echoing strangely. "Dad. Come with us. It doesn't hurt." The figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster. They flowed toward us like a dark tide, their movements unnaturally fluid. I pushed Linda and Jim toward the door, but more figures were emerging from the walls, blocking our escape. That's when I remembered the symbols. The scratches on the walls weren't just random markings, they were part of some kind of ritual. The things outside had been preparing for this moment, turning my cabin into a trap. I had one chance. The emergency flare gun was mounted on the wall near the door. If I could reach it, maybe the light would drive them back. I dove for the flare gun, but one of the tall figures intercepted me. Its elongated fingers wrapped around my throat, and I felt an overwhelming coldness spreading through my body. The thing's face was inches from mine, and I could see that it wasn't blank after all. It had features, but they were constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. With my last bit of strength, I grabbed the flare gun and fired it directly into the creature's face. The brilliant red light filled the room, and every single one of the tall figures screamed in unison, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the death cries of every animal in the forest. They began to dissolve, their forms becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Tyler and Emma collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. The symbols on the walls faded, and suddenly all the electronics in the cabin hummed back to life. We carried the children to my truck and drove straight to the park headquarters. The official report stated that the Henderson family had gotten lost and suffered from exposure and dehydration, leading to shared hallucinations. The strange scratches on my cabin were attributed to bear activity. But I knew the truth. And I knew it wasn't over. I requested a transfer the next week, but the Park Service denied it. They said I was needed at the remote stations, that my experience made me valuable. What they didn't say was that I'd been marked somehow, chosen to be a guardian against things that shouldn't exist. The tall figures still visit sometimes, especially on moonless nights. They stand at the edge of the forest, watching and waiting. They can't enter the cabin anymore. Something about the flare gun incident changed the rules, but I know they're still there. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I can hear them whispering in the trees. They're patient, these watchers in the pines. They have all the time in the world, and they know that eventually, everyone who comes to their forest becomes part of it. The scratches on my cabin walls have grown back, deeper than before. I've tried to sand them away, but they always return. The symbols seem to be alive, shifting and changing when I'm not looking directly at them. And every night, I hear the whispers getting a little bit louder. I'm writing this as a warning to whoever finds it. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, probably taken by the things that live between the trees. Don't come looking for me. Don't trust the forest when it's too quiet. And whatever you do, don't look at the tall figures directly. They're always watching, always waiting. And once they've seen you, they never forget. The Henderson family recovered fully, with no memory of what happened in the forest. Tyler and Emma grew up normally, went to college, got married, had children of their own. But sometimes, on quiet nights, they call me. They don't know why, but they feel drawn to return to the mountains. They dream of tall figures in the trees, and they wake up with the taste of pine needles in their mouths. I always tell them the same thing: stay away from the wilderness. Stay in the cities, surrounded by light and noise and people. Because the forest remembers, and the watchers in the pines are still hungry. But I can't leave. This is my post, my responsibility. Someone has to watch the watchers, to stand guard against the things that slip through the cracks between worlds. Someone has to make sure they don't spread beyond the tree line. The whispers are getting louder now. I can hear them even during the day, carried on the wind like forgotten prayers. They're calling my name, promising things I can't understand. The symbols on the walls pulse with their own internal light, and sometimes I catch glimpses of other places in their shifting patterns: dark forests under alien stars, cities of impossible architecture, and always, always, the tall figures standing guard. I've started having dreams where I'm one of them, standing in the forest with my limbs stretched and my face smooth and blank. In the dreams, I understand their language, and I know their purpose. They're not evil, exactly, they're just following their nature, like wolves or bears or any other predator. But their nature is antithetical to ours, and the two can't coexist. The Park Service has stopped sending people to check on me. My reports are filed but ignored, my requests for backup denied. I think they know what's happening here, but they can't acknowledge it officially. There are some things too dangerous to admit exist. I'm running out of flares. The emergency supplies were never replenished after the Henderson incident, and my requests for new equipment have been lost in bureaucratic channels. The tall figures know this, somehow. They're getting bolder, coming closer to the cabin each night. Last week, I found one of them standing in my kitchen when I woke up. It didn't move or speak, just stood there watching me with its featureless face. When I reached for my sidearm, it faded away like mist. But I could still feel its presence, and I knew it would be back. The forest is changing too. The trees are moving more frequently now, repositioning themselves when I'm not looking. The paths shift and alter, leading to places that shouldn't exist. Hikers who venture too far into the backcountry are found days later, walking in circles and speaking in languages they don't recognize. I've started leaving warnings at the trailheads, unofficial signs that mysteriously disappear within hours of being posted. Park headquarters claims they have no knowledge of unauthorized signage, but I know someone is removing them. Maybe it's the tall figures themselves, or maybe it's something else entirely. The scratches on the cabin walls have formed new patterns now, complex geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. They seem to be a map of sorts, showing the locations of other incursions around the world. If I'm reading them correctly, this isn't an isolated incident. The Watchers in the Pines are just one outpost of something much larger. I've tried to contact other remote rangers, but most of them have gone silent. The few who respond speak in careful, measured tones, as if they're being monitored. They deny any unusual activity in their sectors, but I can hear the fear in their voices. The radio has started picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist, conversations in that alien language, broadcast on frequencies that aren't assigned to any known service. The voices are getting stronger, more frequent, and I'm beginning to understand fragments of what they're saying. They're coordinating something. A convergence. And I'm at the center of it. My time is running out. The tall figures are no longer content to simply watch. They're actively testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses in whatever force keeps them at bay. The cabin's protection is failing, and I don't have the knowledge or resources to repair it. If you find this journal, please don't dismiss it as the ravings of an isolated man. The Watchers in the Pines are real, and they're spreading. Look for the signs: trees that move when no one's watching, electronics that fail without explanation, and most importantly, the tall figures standing at the edge of your vision. They're patient, but they're not passive. They're waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and into our world. And when that moment comes, all the flares in the world won't be enough to stop them. The whispers are calling my name now. I can see them through the window, dozens of tall figures standing in perfect formation among the trees. They're not hiding anymore. They don't need to. It's time for me to join them. But first, I'm going to destroy this cabin and everything in it. If I can't stop them, at least I can make sure they don't use this place as a gateway. The emergency charges I've placed around the foundation should be enough to level the building and scatter the symbols on the walls. To whoever finds this journal in the ruins, don't try to rebuild here. Salt the earth, burn the debris, and forget this place ever existed. The Watchers in the Pines will find other doorways, other guardians to corrupt, but maybe you can buy humanity a little more time. And remember, when the forest is too quiet, and the shadows seem to move on their own, don't look directly at the tall figures. They're always watching, always waiting, and once they've seen you, they never let you go. The countdown has begun. In 10 minutes, this place will be nothing but a crater in the ground. The Watchers in the Pines will have to find another way through. But I suspect they already have. My name is David Kellerman, and I'm a senior ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I've seen tourists fall into hot springs, watched grizzly bears tear apart campsites, and dealt with every kind of natural disaster this volcanic wonderland can throw at you. But in all my years here, I'd never seen anything that made me question the fundamental nature of reality itself. The chunks of flesh were still steaming when I reached them with my flashlight. They were pale white, almost translucent, and riddled with what looked like tiny holes. When I knelt down to examine one more closely, I noticed it was moving, not the random twitching of dead tissue, but purposeful, almost breathing movements. I radioed the incident to headquarters, but the response was pure static. The communication array had been acting up all week, ever since the seismic activity had started increasing. The geological survey team had been monitoring unusual readings from deep beneath the park, but they'd assured us it was just normal volcanic activity. Normal. Nothing about this was normal. I collected samples of the strange flesh in sealed containers, following hazmat protocols I'd learned during my military service. The pieces were surprisingly heavy for their size, as if they were made of something denser than organic matter. And they smelled, not the usual sulfur stench of the thermal features, but something organic and rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun for weeks. By morning, the samples had dissolved completely, leaving behind only a dark, oily residue that seemed to move on its own. The lab equipment couldn't identify the substance, and every test I ran came back with impossible results. The spectrometer showed chemical signatures that didn't match any known elements, and the microscope revealed structures that looked almost crystalline but moved like living cells. The next few days brought more anomalies. Geysers erupting with different colored water, green, black, sometimes with a metallic sheen that hurt to look at directly. The hot springs began producing new sounds, deep rumbling notes that seemed to come from miles underground. And tourists started reporting strange dreams after visiting the thermal features. The dreams were always the same. They found themselves standing in vast underground caverns, surrounded by pools of dark water that reflected no light. In the center of each pool, something massive moved beneath the surface, something that was aware of their presence and hungry for their attention. Dr. Sarah Martinez, our park geologist, was the first to make the connection. She'd been studying the seismic data from the past month, and she noticed a pattern in the underground activity. The tremors weren't random, they were following the park's thermal features, creating a network of connected disturbances that stretched across the entire Yellowstone supervolcano. "It's like something is moving down there," she told me during our emergency meeting. "Something big, following the underground water systems." "Animals don't live in boiling water," I pointed out. "Who said anything about animals?" she replied, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. The third incident happened during the busy afternoon rush. A family from Ohio was taking pictures near the Grand Prismatic Spring when the water level suddenly dropped by several feet. The colorful bacterial mats that gave the spring its famous rainbow appearance began to writhe and shift, forming patterns that looked almost like writing in some alien script. Then the screaming started. Not from the tourists, from the spring itself. The sound echoed up from the depths, a high-pitched wail that made everyone within 100 yards cover their ears. The water began to bubble more violently, and something rose from the center of the spring. It was huge, maybe 20 feet across, and covered in the same pale, hole-riddled flesh I'd found after the geyser eruption. But this was clearly alive, pulsing with its own internal rhythm. As it breached the surface, I could see it had no fixed shape. It flowed and twisted like liquid, but with a purpose that suggested intelligence. The tourists panicked, running in all directions. I tried to maintain order, but I was just as terrified as they were. The thing in the spring was looking at us, not with eyes, but with an awareness that pressed against my mind like a physical weight. It was studying us, learning about us, and I had the horrible certainty that it found us wanting. The creature sank back into the spring after maybe 30 seconds, but the damage was done. Within hours, video footage was spreading across social media, despite our attempts to confiscate cameras and phones. The Park Service went into full damage control mode, claiming the incident was a rare but natural phenomenon caused by underground gas pockets. But I knew better. And so did Dr. Martinez. We started investigating the park's thermal features more thoroughly, using remote sensors and underwater cameras to probe the depths. What we found defied explanation. The underground water systems were connected by vast chambers that extended far deeper than should have been possible. And in those chambers, we detected movement, massive forms that dwarfed anything in the fossil record. The really disturbing part was that the movement seemed coordinated. The creatures, and there were definitely multiple entities down there, were following patterns that suggested communication, possibly even planning. They were using the thermal features as a network, passing information through the heated water like some kind of biological internet. Dr. Martinez made another discovery that changed everything. She found historical records dating back to the park's founding, reports of similar incidents that had been classified and buried. Native American oral history spoke of things that lived in the sacred waters, ancient beings that had slept beneath the earth since before human memory. The Crow and Shoshone tribes had specific warnings about disturbing the thermal features. They spoke of entities that fed on warmth and life, creatures that could reach into the minds of anyone who came too close to their domain. The early park rangers had dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, but now I wasn't so sure. The incidents were escalating. Every day brought new reports of strange behavior from the thermal features. Geysers erupting with impossible timing, hot springs changing color overnight, and always, the dreams. Visitors to the park began reporting shared nightmares. They dreamed of being pulled down into the boiling water, but instead of death, they found themselves in vast underwater cities populated by things that had never seen sunlight. The creatures in these cities were building something, massive structures that served purposes beyond human comprehension. I started having the dreams too. In my nightmares, I was standing at the edge of a lake of liquid fire, deep beneath the park. The water was so hot it glowed with its own light, and in that light, I could see them, the hunger beneath Yellowstone. They were beautiful in their alien way, like jellyfish made of living metal, but their beauty was terrible and wrong. They spoke to me in the dreams, not with words but with direct transmission of meaning into my mind. They told me they had been sleeping for eons, waiting for the right conditions to wake. The thermal activity of the park was their life support system, and now that system was finally reaching the critical point they needed. They were hungry. So very hungry. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid. I began to lose track of where the nightmares ended and reality began. Sometimes I would wake up standing in my backyard, looking toward the park, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The thermal features were calling to me, promising answers to questions I didn't know how to ask. Dr. Martinez was experiencing the same thing. We compared notes and found disturbing similarities in our dreams. The creatures were showing us the same visions, vast underground networks, cities of impossible architecture, and always the hunger, the endless, patient hunger. We tried to warn the park administration, but they dismissed our concerns as stress-related hallucinations. The incidents were being explained away as natural phenomena, and the video evidence was being discredited by expert analysis. The official position was that nothing unusual was happening at Yellowstone. But the tourists knew better. Visitor numbers started dropping as word spread about the strange occurrences. Those who did come often left after a single night, claiming the park felt wrong somehow. The thermal features were becoming more active, more aggressive, and the dreams were spreading to anyone who spent time near them. That's when I made my decision. If the Park Service wouldn't listen to official warnings, maybe they'd pay attention to a more dramatic demonstration. I started collecting evidence, water samples, photographs, seismic readings, anything that might prove what was happening beneath our feet. The breakthrough came when I managed to get a clear photograph of one of the creatures. It was during another eruption of Old Faithful, and I was ready with a high-speed camera. The image showed something that shouldn't have been possible, a being that seemed to exist partially in our dimension and partially somewhere else. The creature was translucent, its internal structures visible through semi-transparent flesh. But those structures weren't organic in any sense I understood. They were geometric, crystalline, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of the being was something that looked like a star, a point of light so bright it burned after images into my retinas. I showed the photograph to Dr. Martinez, and she went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The energy readings from something like that would be off the charts." "Maybe they are," I said. "Maybe that's what's causing all the seismic activity." We ran the numbers, and the results were terrifying. If creatures like this were living in the thermal features, their energy output would be enormous. And if they were preparing to become more active, the consequences for the park, and potentially the entire region, could be catastrophic. The Yellowstone supervolcano sits on top of a massive magma chamber. If something disturbed that chamber, the resulting eruption could devastate most of North America. The creatures beneath the park weren't just a local threat, they were potentially an extinction-level event waiting to happen. We tried to present our findings to the park administration, but our concerns were dismissed. The official position remained that nothing unusual was occurring. Our reports were filed but ignored, our evidence was discredited, and we were told to stop spreading panic among the tourists. But the tourists didn't need our warnings. They could feel it themselves, the wrongness that was spreading through the park like an infection. The thermal features were becoming more aggressive, more alien. The water temperatures were rising beyond normal ranges, and new vents were opening up in areas that had been geologically stable for centuries. The dreams were getting worse too. I was spending most of my time in the underground cities now, walking through corridors that stretched for miles beneath the earth. The creatures were showing me their history, eons of sleep and waiting, patience beyond human comprehension. They had been here long before humans existed, and they would be here long after we were gone. But now they were hungry. They fed on thermal energy, on the life force that flowed through the earth itself. The Yellowstone thermal features were their pantry, and they were finally ready to feast. The increased seismic activity was their way of preparing the table, stirring up the magma chambers and increasing the energy flow. I realized with growing horror that the park wasn't just their home, it was their farm. They had been cultivating the thermal features for millennia, slowly building up the energy reserves they needed for their awakening. And now the harvest was ready. The first major eruption happened on a Tuesday morning. Mount Washburn, which had been dormant for over 600,000 years, suddenly came to life. The explosion was visible from space, sending a column of ash and steam 50 miles into the atmosphere. But mixed with the ash were pieces of that pale, hole-riddled flesh, scattered across 3 states. The creatures were emerging. I was on duty at the observation station when I saw them rising from the thermal features all across the park. They moved like liquid metal, flowing up from the depths with impossible grace. Some were small, maybe the size of a car, but others were massive, titans that dwarfed the geysers they emerged from. They weren't attacking, exactly. They were exploring, testing the boundaries of their new environment. But their very presence was transforming the landscape. Wherever they touched, the ground became superheated, turning solid rock into molten slag. Trees burst into flame from their proximity, and the air itself seemed to burn. The evacuation orders came too late. By the time the Park Service acknowledged the severity of the situation, the creatures had spread throughout the thermal basin. Roads were impassable, communication systems were down, and most of the park's infrastructure was either melting or had been consumed by the spontaneous fires. I tried to reach my truck, but the parking area was filled with one of the larger creatures. It stood 30 feet tall, its translucent body pulsing with internal light. As I watched, it extended what might have been an appendage toward a group of tourists who had been trapped in the visitor center. The tourists didn't scream. They just stood there, perfectly still, as the creature's touch enveloped them. Their bodies began to glow with the same internal light, and I realized with dawning horror that they were being absorbed, not physically, but somehow converted into energy that the creature could use. I ran. The trails were chaos. Panicked visitors were fleeing in all directions, but many of them were moving toward the thermal features instead of away from them. The creature's influence was spreading, compelling people to approach their feeding grounds. Those who got too close simply stood there, smiling beatifically, as they were consumed. Dr. Martinez found me near the Mammoth Hot Springs. She was wild-eyed and covered in ash, her clothes singed from getting too close to one of the creatures. "They're not just here," she gasped. "I've been monitoring the global seismic network. Thermal features all over the world are showing similar activity. Yellowstone was just the beginning." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If these creatures existed in thermal features worldwide, then what we were seeing was just a small preview of what was coming. Every hot spring, every geyser, every volcanic vent on Earth could potentially be harboring one of these entities. "We have to get out of here," I said. "We have to warn people." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull of the creature's influence. The dreams were bleeding into waking reality, and part of me wanted to walk toward the nearest thermal feature and let myself be absorbed. It would be so easy, so peaceful. No more fear, no more responsibility, just the warm embrace of something infinitely larger than myself. Dr. Martinez grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my flesh. "Fight it," she said. "Whatever you're feeling, fight it. They're in our heads." We made it to the park boundary just as the military cordoned off the area. The official explanation was that a massive volcanic event had required emergency evacuation, but I could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't understand what. The quarantine lasted 3 weeks. Satellite images showed the thermal features continuing to erupt with increasing frequency, and the temperature readings from inside the park were off the charts. But no official information was released about the creatures themselves. When the park finally reopened, everything had changed. The thermal features were still there, but they were different, more active, more alien. The water in the springs was a different color, and the sounds they made were like nothing in nature. Tourists reported strange dreams after visiting, and several people had to be hospitalized after getting too close to the features. I tried to return to work, but I couldn't handle it. Every time I looked at a thermal feature, I could see them moving beneath the surface, waiting patiently for their next opportunity to feed. The dreams had never stopped, and in them, the creatures showed me their long-term plans. They were patient. They had waited eons to wake up, and they were willing to wait a little longer to fully emerge. But they were spreading, using the underground thermal networks to communicate with their kind around the world. Every volcanic eruption, every new hot spring, every geothermal vent was potentially a new doorway for them to enter our world. I submitted my resignation and left Yellowstone for good. But I couldn't escape the knowledge of what was sleeping beneath the earth. I started monitoring geological surveys and thermal activity reports from around the world, tracking the creature's gradual expansion. Iceland was next. The geyser hot spring area began showing unusual activity, and several tourists reported shared dreams about underwater cities. Then it was Japan, where the hot springs in Hakone started producing water that glowed with its own light. New Zealand followed, with the Rotorua geothermal field experiencing unprecedented eruptions. Each incident was explained away as natural phenomena, but I knew better. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was spreading, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The creatures were patient, but they were also methodical. They were using the thermal features as staging areas, gradually building up their presence on the surface. Each successful emergence made the next one easier, and each new location they colonized expanded their network of influence. I tried to warn people, but who would believe me? A former park ranger claiming that alien creatures were living in hot springs sounded like the ravings of someone who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The official reports dismissed all unusual activity as natural geological processes, and the video evidence was always explained away or discredited. But the dreams were spreading. People all over the world began reporting the same nightmares: vast underwater cities, beings of living light, and always the hunger, the patient, eternal hunger. Support groups formed online for those affected by the dreams, but they were quickly infiltrated and discredited by unknown forces. I realized that the creatures weren't just waiting for the right moment to emerge, they were preparing us. The dreams were a form of conditioning, slowly acclimating humanity to their presence. Those who were most susceptible to their influence were being converted into willing servants, ready to help facilitate their emergence. The conversion process was subtle but irreversible. People who had extensive exposure to the thermal features began showing signs of change: increased body temperature, unusual sleep patterns, and most disturbing of all, an irresistible compulsion to return to the places where they had first encountered the creatures. Dr. Martinez was one of the first converts. I tried to maintain contact with her after leaving Yellowstone, but her emails became increasingly strange. She wrote about the beauty of the creatures, their ancient wisdom, and the privilege of being chosen to serve them. When I finally saw her in person, her eyes had changed. They reflected light differently, with an internal luminescence that was both beautiful and terrifying. She tried to convince me to return to Yellowstone, speaking of the peace and purpose she had found in service to the creatures. But I could see past her words to the alien intelligence that was speaking through her. The thing that had been Dr. Martinez was gone, replaced by something that wore her face but served inhuman masters. I went into hiding after that, moving from place to place and avoiding all thermal features. But the creature's influence was spreading faster than I could run. Every month brought new reports of unusual geothermal activity, and each incident was followed by an increase in the number of people experiencing the dreams. The tipping point came 2 years after the Yellowstone incident. Mount Vesuvius, which had been relatively quiet for decades, suddenly roared back to life. But this wasn't a normal eruption. The lava flows were moving with purpose, forming geometric patterns that could be seen from orbit. And rising from the crater were beings of living fire, creatures similar to those I had seen in Yellowstone but adapted to the different thermal environment. Italy fell within a week. Not to military conquest, but to mass conversion. People flocked to the volcanic region, drawn by dreams and compulsions they couldn't resist. Those who were absorbed by the creatures became willing servants, helping to prepare for the next phase of the emergence. The world governments finally acknowledged that something unprecedented was happening, but their response was too little, too late. Military strikes against the thermal features only made the creatures more active, and nuclear weapons proved ineffective against beings that fed on energy itself. The creatures began emerging from thermal features worldwide, each emergence perfectly coordinated with the others. It was clear they had been planning this for eons, waiting for the right moment when their network was strong enough to support a global manifestation. I watched the end of the world from a bunker in Alaska, as far from any geothermal activity as I could get. But even there, I could feel their influence growing stronger. The aurora borealis began showing unusual patterns, and the ground beneath my feet occasionally trembled with activity that had nothing to do with tectonic plates. The last communication I received from the outside world was a video message from someone claiming to be a government scientist. But I could see the telltale glow in his eyes, the slightly too perfect smile of someone who had been converted. He spoke of humanity's evolution, of joining with beings who had existed since the dawn of time, of the peace that came with surrendering to something infinitely greater than ourselves. The message ended with coordinates, the location of a new thermal vent that had opened near my position. He assured me that if I came to the vent, all my questions would be answered, all my fears would be laid to rest. I can see the glow from here, even through the reinforced walls of my shelter. The aurora has turned a deep red color, and I can hear something moving beneath the ice. The creatures have found me, despite all my precautions. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was never really about Yellowstone at all. It was about Earth itself, about converting our entire planet into a thermal garden where they could feed and multiply. They succeeded beyond my worst nightmares, and now there's nowhere left to run. I can feel their influence in my mind now, the same peaceful compulsion that converted Dr. Martinez and countless others. Part of me wants to surrender, to walk out into the red-tinged night and let them absorb me. It would be so much easier than fighting. But I'm writing this as my final act of resistance. If anyone finds this record, know that the creatures aren't evil in any human sense, they're just following their nature, like any other predator. But their nature is incompatible with ours, and they've won. The thermal vents are calling to me now, promising warmth in this frozen wasteland. I can see figures moving in the red light, beautiful beings of living energy who want nothing more than to welcome me home. I think I'll go to them now. The cold is getting unbearable, and they're offering such warmth, such peace. Maybe conversion isn't so bad after all. Maybe it's just the next step in human evolution. The hunger beneath Yellowstone was never really hungry for destruction. It was hungry for transformation, for the privilege of reshaping an entire world in its own image. And looking at the beautiful creatures dancing in the thermal light, I'm starting to think they might have been right all along. The warmth is calling to me. I can't resist it anymore. I'm going home. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've been a ranger at Dead Horse Point State Park in Utah for 8 years. It's a small park, just a few thousand acres of high desert perched on the edge of a 1,000-foot cliff overlooking the Colorado River. Most visitors come for the view. They call it the Grand Canyon of Utah, but I've always been drawn to the isolation, the sense that you're standing at the very edge of the world. The screaming started on the anniversary of the incident that gave the point its name. According to legend, cowboys once used the mesa as a natural corral, driving wild mustangs across the narrow neck of land and trapping them on the point. But one group of horses was left behind and died of thirst within sight of the Colorado River, unable to find their way back across the treacherous rock formations. That was over a century ago, but sometimes, especially at dusk, you could swear you heard the sound of hoofbeats echoing across the desert. The old-timers said it was just the wind, but I've lived in the desert long enough to know the difference between wind and something else entirely. The first sign something was wrong came during my morning patrol. I found footprints in the sand near the main overlook, human prints, but they were wrong somehow. They were too deep, as if the person making them had been impossibly heavy, and they followed a path that led straight to the cliff edge and stopped. No body at the bottom of the canyon. No sign of rappelling equipment. Just footprints that ended at a 1,000-foot drop into empty air. I radioed it in, but dispatch was dealing with a search and rescue operation on the other side of the park. A family of 4 had gone missing during what should have been a simple day hike, and all available personnel were committed to finding them. The mysterious footprints would have to wait. I should mention that Dead Horse Point had been experiencing unusual activity for the past month. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and most disturbing of all, reports from visitors about seeing people who shouldn't have been there. The sightings were always similar, lone figures standing at the edge of the cliff, usually just before dawn or after sunset. When approached, these figures would simply vanish, as if they had never been there at all. Security cameras captured nothing, and searches of the area revealed no evidence of human presence. The park administration had dismissed these reports as tricks of the light, mirages caused by the extreme temperature variations in the desert. But the reports kept coming, and they were getting more detailed. Visitors described the figures as wearing outdated ranger uniforms, the kind used decades ago, before modern safety equipment and communication gear. The figures never moved or acknowledged the presence of others, they just stood motionless, staring out over the canyon as if waiting for something. I'd started staying late, hoping to see one of these apparitions myself. The park was beautiful at sunset, when the red rock formations caught the last light and glowed like embers. But it was also unsettling, especially when you were alone with nothing but wind and silence and the growing certainty that you were being watched. That's when I heard the screaming. It started as a low moan, barely audible over the wind. But it quickly grew louder, more desperate, rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The sound was coming from beneath my feet, as if something trapped inside the rock itself was crying out in agony. I grabbed my emergency radio, but the frequency was full of static. Even my cell phone showed no signal, despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. Whatever was happening, I was dealing with it alone. The screaming continued for maybe 5 minutes, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound had been. It was too complete, as if every living thing in the desert had suddenly held its breath. That's when I saw them. They were standing along the cliff edge, maybe a dozen figures in old-style ranger uniforms. But something was wrong with their proportions. They were too tall, too thin, as if they had been stretched by some invisible force. And their faces were holes in the world, empty spaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I approached cautiously, my hand on my sidearm even though I knew bullets wouldn't help against whatever these things were. As I got closer, I could see that their uniforms were rotting, falling apart as if they had been worn for decades without maintenance. Name tags hung from their shirts, but the writing was too faded to read. One of them turned toward me, and I saw that what I had taken for a face was actually a void, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. When it looked at me, I felt a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw me into that emptiness. I stumbled backward, and the figure raised what might have been an arm. The other figures turned toward me as well, their void faces creating a constellation of darkness against the red rock backdrop. They began to move in my direction, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric tearing, as if their very presence was damaging the fabric of reality. The sound grew louder as they gained on me, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I made it to my truck and locked the doors, though I knew it was a useless gesture. The figures surrounded the vehicle, pressing their void faces against the windows. The glass began to frost over where they touched it, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The humming grew louder, more complex, resolving into what almost sounded like voices. They were trying to communicate, but in a language that predated human speech. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, speaking directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembered what it was like to be prey. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The frost melted from the windows, and the desert returned to its normal temperature. but I could still feel their presence, lurking somewhere just outside normal reality. I drove straight to park headquarters and filed a report, but I could see the skepticism in my supervisor's eyes. Rangers were supposed to be reliable, rational people who could handle the isolation and stress of desert patrol. Claiming to see ghostly figures with void faces wasn't exactly career-enhancing behavior. But the next morning brought evidence that couldn't be dismissed. The search and rescue team had found the missing family, or what was left of them. They were discovered at the bottom of a previously unknown cave system, apparently having fallen through what the geological survey later determined was a sinkhole that had opened recently. The bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, despite having been missing for less than 48 hours. But more disturbing were the positions they were found in, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, with their arms reaching toward the center where nothing visible existed. The coroner's report was inconclusive. The cause of death was listed as environmental exposure, but the condition of the bodies suggested they had been dead for much longer than the timeline indicated. There were also anomalous findings, tissue damage that didn't match any known environmental cause, and most puzzling of all, the complete absence of any wildlife activity. Bodies left in the desert are typically disturbed by scavengers within hours, but these showed no sign of animal contact. Even insects had avoided them, creating a perfect circle of emptiness around the site. I volunteered for the investigation, despite my supervisor's obvious reluctance to assign me to the case. But I was the most experienced desert ranger on staff, and the cave system needed to be properly mapped and secured to prevent future accidents. Descending into the cave was like entering another world. The walls were smooth, almost polished, as if something had been moving through the passages for so long that it had worn away all the rough edges. The air was thick and humid, completely different from the dry desert atmosphere above. My equipment started malfunctioning immediately. The GPS couldn't establish a position, the radio produced only static, and most disturbing of all, my flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than illuminating it. I could see maybe 10 feet in any direction, and beyond that was a blackness so complete it seemed solid. The cave system was vast, extending much deeper than the geological surveys had indicated. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, marking my route with chalk to ensure I could find my way back. But when I looked behind me, the chalk marks were gone, erased as if they had never been there. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the caves. Something was moving in the darkness ahead of me, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall and thin, like the figures I had seen at the cliff edge, but down here in the caves it moved with more purpose, more intelligence. It was leading me somewhere, drawing me deeper into passages that shouldn't have existed. I tried to turn back, but the passages had changed. The cave system was rearranging itself around me, creating new tunnels and closing off others. My chalk marks weren't disappearing because someone was erasing them, they were disappearing because the walls themselves were shifting and changing. The humming started again, emanating from somewhere deep in the cave system. But down here, surrounded by rock and darkness, it was louder, more complex. I could almost make out individual voices in the sound, dozens or maybe hundreds of them, all singing the same inhuman song. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and I stopped dead at what I saw there. They were everywhere, dozens of the tall, void-faced figures, standing in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. But these weren't the rotting uniforms I had seen above ground. These figures were pristine, their ranger uniforms clean and pressed, their equipment polished and new. As I watched, more figures emerged from side passages, taking their places in the formation. They moved with military precision, as if following orders I couldn't hear. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that was different from the others, taller, more solid, with insignia that marked it as some kind of leader. The leader figure turned toward me, and I saw that its void face was larger than the others, a perfect circle of darkness that seemed to pull at my vision. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind. "Welcome, Ranger Vasquez." The voice was like the humming, alien and ancient, but somehow I understood it perfectly. The figure gestured toward the assembled ranks of void-faced rangers. "You are joining a proud tradition. We have been guardians of this place for much longer than your kind realizes." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't obey. Something was holding me in place, drawing me inexorably toward the center of the chamber. "Do not be afraid. We do not wish to harm you. We wish to recruit you." The other figures began to move, closing in around me. Up close, I could see that their uniforms bore name tags: Thompson, Martinez, Kowalski, names I recognized from park records. These were rangers who had gone missing over the years, declared dead or transferred to other assignments. "The park needs protectors, Ranger Vasquez. Not just from human threats, but from things that come from elsewhere. We guard the boundaries between worlds." The leader gestured toward the walls of the chamber, and I saw that they were covered in symbols, not carved, but burned into the rock as if by intense heat. The symbols seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Dead Horse Point is not named for the horses that died here. It is named for the boundary between life and death, between your reality and ours. We stand watch at that boundary, preventing things from crossing over that should not cross over. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What things?" The leader figure's void face seemed to deepen, becoming an infinite well of darkness. "You have seen them. The screaming in the rock. The footprints that end at the cliff edge. Dead Horse Point is a thin place, where the barriers between dimensions grow weak. Sometimes things slip through." The other figures began to hum again, their voices creating harmonics that made the symbols on the walls glow with a faint, sickly light. In that light, I could see movement in the shadows, things that had too many limbs, or no limbs at all, creatures that belonged to geometries that hurt to contemplate. "We contain them. We send them back. But we cannot do it alone. We need rangers, protectors who understand the true nature of this place." "The missing people," I said. "The family we found in the cave." "You killed them." "No. We saved them. There are things worse than death, Ranger Vasquez. Things that would use human bodies as doorways, human minds as anchors in your reality. We offer a different path." The void face seemed to expand, filling my vision. I could feel myself being drawn into it, my consciousness dissolving at the edges. "Join us. Become a guardian of the thin places. Help us protect both worlds from what waits in the spaces between." The pull was almost irresistible. Part of me wanted to surrender, to let myself be absorbed into that perfect darkness. It would be so much easier than fighting, so much simpler than trying to understand forces beyond human comprehension. But something made me resist. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the training that had been drilled into me during my years as a ranger. I was sworn to protect the park and its visitors, and these things, whatever they were, represented a threat to both. I focused on that oath, using it as an anchor to pull myself back from the edge of the void. The leader figure's humming grew more insistent, and the other void-faced rangers began to close in, but I held on to my sense of duty like a lifeline. "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I won't join you." The chamber erupted in chaos. The void-faced figures began to wail, their voices combining into a sound like tearing metal. The symbols on the walls flared with brilliant light, and cracks began to appear in the stone ceiling. I ran, following instincts rather than memory through passages that seemed to shift and change with every step. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit, not just the void-faced rangers, but other things, the creatures they claimed to be containing. The cave system was collapsing, or maybe it was being destroyed by the conflict between the rangers and the things they guarded against. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and gaps opened in the floor, revealing depths that glowed with their own malevolent light. I made it to the surface just as the ground beneath Dead Horse Point began to shake. The overlook where I had first seen the void-faced figures was cracking, huge chunks of red rock breaking away and tumbling into the canyon below. But I wasn't alone. They were everywhere now, the void-faced rangers, standing at attention around the perimeter of the collapse. They weren't trying to stop the destruction, they were directing it, using their combined will to seal off whatever had been contained in the caves below. The leader figure appeared beside me, its uniform now showing signs of the battle that had raged in the depths. "You chose poorly, Ranger Vasquez. Now we must find another way." "What's happening?" I demanded. "The barriers are breaking down. Too many people, too much attention, too many disturbances of the thin places. We can no longer contain what seeks to cross over." The ground shook again, and I saw something rise from the collapsing cave system, a tentacle or appendage that belonged to something vast and impossible. The void-faced rangers immediately focused their attention on it, their combined humming becoming a weapon that forced the thing back into whatever dimension it had come from. "We have held the line for over a century, but our time is ending. Soon, others will have to take up the burden." "What others?" But the leader figure was already fading, becoming translucent as the emergency passed. The last thing I heard was its voice in my mind. "You will understand, in time. Dead Horse Point chooses its own guardians." The official report blamed the ground collapse on unstable geological conditions exacerbated by recent seismic activity. The cave system was sealed off for public safety, and new warning signs were erected around the overlook area. But I knew the truth. The void-faced rangers were still there, standing guard at the boundary between worlds. And sometimes, especially at sunset, I could see them at the edge of my vision, tall, thin figures in ranger uniforms, watching and waiting. The screaming from the rocks had stopped, at least for now. But I knew it would return, along with the other signs that Dead Horse Point was more than just a scenic overlook. It was a fortress, manned by guardians who had sacrificed their humanity to protect both worlds from threats beyond imagination. I requested a transfer, but it was denied. The Park Service claimed they needed experienced rangers at remote locations, but I suspected the truth was more complex. Dead Horse Point had chosen me, just as it had chosen the others before me. I've been having dreams lately, visions of vast underground chambers and creatures that exist in dimensions perpendicular to our own. In the dreams, I'm wearing a ranger uniform that never gets dirty, never needs maintenance. My face is a void that absorbs light, and my voice is part of a harmony that holds reality together. The other rangers, the living ones, have started avoiding me. They say I stand too still during my patrols, that I stare at the horizon for hours without blinking. They complain that I hum unconsciously, creating harmonics that make their equipment malfunction. I think they're right. I can feel myself changing, becoming something that exists partially in this world and partially in the spaces between. It's not unpleasant, exactly, more like shedding a skin that had become too tight. The void-faced leader visits me sometimes, standing at the edge of the overlook where the barrier between worlds is thinnest. It doesn't speak anymore, but I can sense its approval. I'm becoming what Dead Horse Point needs me to become. Soon, I'll join the others in their eternal vigil. I'll stand guard at the thin places, holding back the things that wait in the darkness between dimensions. It's not the career I planned, but it's the duty I've been chosen for. Dead Horse Point needs its rangers, and we need the point. It's a symbiotic relationship that has lasted for over a century, and it will continue long after the current maps of Utah have been forgotten. The screaming in the rocks has started again, but now I understand what it means. It's not a sound of pain or fear, it's a warning, a signal that the barriers are under stress and need reinforcement. I can hear my fellow rangers responding, their voices joining in the harmony that holds the thin places together. Soon, my voice will join theirs, and together we'll stand watch over the boundaries of reality itself. The Park Service will find a replacement for me, just as they found replacements for all the others. The new ranger will experience the same strange incidents, the same unexplained phenomena, and eventually they'll understand their true purpose. Dead Horse Point chooses its own guardians, and once chosen, we serve forever. The transformation is almost complete now. I can feel my face becoming smooth, featureless, a perfect void that will absorb the light of our dimension while reflecting the darkness of others. My uniform grows cleaner, more pressed, as if it's being maintained by forces beyond normal understanding. Tomorrow, I'll take my place among the void-faced rangers, standing guard at the edge of the world. It's not death, exactly, it's evolution, becoming something more than human in service of a cause greater than any one individual. The screaming has stopped again. The barriers hold, at least for now. But I know they'll weaken again, and when they do, the Rangers of Dead Horse Point will be ready. We're always ready. We're always watching. And we'll stand guard at the thin places until the stars burn out and the boundaries between worlds no longer matter. The sun is setting now, painting the red rocks with shades of fire. It's beautiful, this place that has become my eternal home. And in the growing darkness, I can see my fellow rangers taking their positions along the cliff edge. Soon, I'll join them. Soon, I'll become what Dead Horse Point needs me to be. The void is calling, and I'm ready to answer. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been a wilderness ranger in the North Cascades for 12 years. I know every trail, every peak, every hidden valley in this corner of Washington State. The mountains are my home, my sanctuary, and my responsibility. But that morning, hiking through what should have been familiar territory, I felt like I was walking through an alien landscape. The silence had started 3 days earlier, according to the reports I'd been getting from hikers and backpackers. They described patches of forest where all sound simply ceased, creating invisible boundaries between the normal world and something else entirely. The affected areas were growing, spreading along the trail system like some kind of acoustic infection. I was investigating the latest incident when I encountered my first zone of absolute silence. One moment I was listening to the normal sounds of the forest, wind, water, wildlife, and the next, it was as if I had been struck deaf. But I could still hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, which meant the silence was external, something being imposed on the environment rather than a problem with my hearing. I marked the boundary with GPS and stepped back into the normal world, where sound returned like a physical blow. The contrast was jarring, almost painful, and I had to sit down for a moment to recover my equilibrium. Whatever was creating these silent zones, it was affecting the basic properties of the atmosphere itself. The reports from affected hikers were uniformly disturbing. They described a sense of being watched, of movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they looked directly at it. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the trees, not quite human, but close enough to be unsettling. The figures never made any sound, even when walking through areas of dense undergrowth. I radioed headquarters, but the response was frustratingly bureaucratic. The phenomenon was being classified as a weather anomaly, possibly related to unusual atmospheric pressure systems. Park scientists were supposedly investigating, but no additional resources were being allocated to the problem. That night, camping near the edge of the first silent zone, I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, when I heard something else, a low, thrumming note that seemed to come from deep underground. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it had a rhythm that suggested intelligence, purpose. The sound grew stronger as the night progressed, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the silent zone. Whatever was creating the silence during the day was producing this thrumming at night, as if the two phenomena were connected, opposite sides of the same impossible equation. I crept to the edge of the silent boundary and discovered that the thrumming was louder there, but still not quite crossing into the normal world. It was as if something was transmitting from inside the zone of silence, broadcasting on frequencies that ordinary sound couldn't penetrate. That's when I saw them. Moving through the silent forest were figures that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that were hard to define. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical laws. Most disturbing of all, they cast no shadows, even in the bright moonlight. The figures were clearly aware of my presence, but they showed no interest in approaching. They moved through the silent zone with purpose, following paths that weren't visible to me but were obviously meaningful to them. Some carried what looked like tools or instruments, devices that glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light. I watched them for hours, taking notes and trying to understand their behavior. They seemed to be working, performing some kind of maintenance or construction activity within the silent zone. The thrumming sound grew stronger when they were active, and I began to suspect that they were somehow responsible for creating the zones of silence. As dawn approached, the figures began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The thrumming stopped, and the oppressive silence returned to the forest. Whatever these beings were, they were active only during the night hours, hiding in the daylight like some kind of reverse vampire. I hiked back to the ranger station and filed a detailed report, but I could see the skepticism in my supervisor's eyes. Rangers were supposed to deal with real problems: lost hikers, wildlife encounters, search and rescue operations. Claiming to see ghostly figures working in zones of supernatural silence wasn't exactly standard operating procedure. But the zones were expanding. Every day brought new reports from hikers, and the affected areas were growing larger and more numerous. The Pacific Crest Trail was becoming increasingly dangerous, not because of any physical threat, but because the disorientation caused by the silent zones was leading to accidents and panic. 3 hikers had to be airlifted out after becoming lost in what should have been familiar territory. They claimed that the trail markers had vanished, that familiar landmarks had disappeared, and that they had wandered in circles for hours without being able to find their way out of the silence. I volunteered to conduct a more thorough investigation, despite my supervisor's obvious reluctance. Something was happening in the North Cascades, something that threatened both the wilderness and the people who visited it. As a ranger, it was my responsibility to understand and address the threat. I equipped myself with specialized recording equipment and headed back into the mountains, this time prepared for an extended stay in the affected area. My plan was to map the boundaries of the silent zones, document any changes in their size or behavior, and hopefully gather evidence of what was causing them. The first thing I noticed was that the zones had indeed grown. What had been isolated patches of silence were now connected, forming corridors that stretched for miles along the trail system. Hikers were being forced to take increasingly circuitous routes to avoid the affected areas. More disturbing was the discovery that the zones weren't static. They moved, expanding and contracting according to some pattern I couldn't discern. I would mark a boundary in the morning, only to find it had shifted by hundreds of yards by evening. The recording equipment I had brought proved useless within the silent zones. Not only did it fail to pick up any sound, but the devices themselves malfunctioned, their electronic components seemingly affected by whatever force was creating the silence. On my third night in the wilderness, I experienced something that changed my understanding of the phenomenon entirely. I was camped at the edge of a particularly large silent zone when I heard the thrumming again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words bypassed my conscious mind, creating meaning directly in my thoughts. They were talking about harvesting, about collection and storage. They spoke of frequencies and resonances, of sound as a form of energy that could be captured and used. And they spoke of us, the humans who moved through their territory, producing the acoustic energy they needed. I realized with growing horror that the silent zones weren't an accidental side effect of their presence. They were deliberate constructions, acoustic vacuum chambers designed to collect and concentrate sound energy. Every word spoken by a hiker, every footstep on the trail, every breath taken within the zones was being absorbed and stored by the entities that created them. The figures appeared again, but this time they seemed more solid, more present. I could see details of their construction that had been hidden before. They weren't alive in any biological sense, but rather some kind of advanced technology given form. Their bodies were composed of crystalline structures that resonated with the sounds they collected, creating the thrumming harmonics I had been hearing. One of the figures approached my position, and I found I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed by fear, but because the entity was somehow manipulating the air pressure around me, creating zones of high and low pressure that held me in place like invisible chains. The figure extended what might have been a hand, and I felt something probe the edges of my mind. It was reading me, scanning my thoughts and memories with casual ease. In return, I caught glimpses of its own thoughts, vast, alien concepts that dealt with sound as a fundamental force of the universe. Through that connection, I learned the truth about what was happening in the North Cascades. The entities weren't from our world. They came from a dimension where sound was the primary form of matter, where acoustic vibrations could be shaped and molded like clay. They had discovered our reality by accident, drawn by the complex harmonics created by human activity. Our world was incredibly rich in acoustic energy compared to theirs. Every sound we made, from the roar of cities to the whisper of wind through trees, represented vast amounts of harvestable energy. The entities had come here to mine our dimension, using the silent zones as collection points. But they were careful, surgical in their approach. They didn't want to destroy our world or harm its inhabitants unnecessarily. They were simply taking what they needed, like we might harvest grain from a field. The problem was that their needs were growing, and the collection zones were expanding faster than they had anticipated. The figure released its hold on my mind and stepped back. Through the connection we had shared, I understood that it was offering me a choice. I could continue to oppose their activities, in which case they would be forced to take more drastic measures to protect their operation. Or I could help them understand our world better, serve as a liaison between their kind and ours. The offer was accompanied by visions of what cooperation might bring: technology beyond our current understanding, the ability to manipulate sound and vibration in ways that could revolutionize human civilization. They weren't conquerors, they were traders, offering advancement in exchange for what they needed. But I also saw the ultimate cost of their presence. If they continued their harvesting operations, eventually all sound would disappear from our world. We would be left in perfect, eternal silence, not dead, but fundamentally altered, living in a reality where acoustic communication was impossible. I made my choice. No, I said, my voice seeming impossibly loud after the hours of silence. Find another way. The figure tilted its head, and I felt its disappointment through our fading connection. It communicated one final concept: inevitability. They had invested too much in establishing their presence here to simply abandon the operation. If I wouldn't help them minimize the impact, they would proceed without consideration for our welfare. The entity faded back into the darkness, and the thrumming resumed, louder and more urgent than before. Around me, I could see the boundaries of the silent zone expanding, growing larger with each passing moment. Whatever I had said or done, it had accelerated their timeline. I ran back toward the ranger station, but the zones of silence were spreading faster than I could move. I found myself trapped in corridors of quiet, forced to follow paths that led deeper into the affected area rather than out of it. The thrumming was everywhere now, coming from the ground beneath my feet, from the air around me, from the very rocks and trees of the mountains. The entities were activating their full collection apparatus, preparing for a massive harvesting operation. I tried to radio for help, but the communication equipment was dead. Not broken, simply unable to function in an environment where sound itself was being systematically removed. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a reality that was becoming increasingly alien. That's when I realized the true scope of their operation. The North Cascades weren't their only collection site. The expanding zones of silence were just one part of a network that stretched across the entire region, possibly the entire continent. They had been operating for years, maybe decades, slowly building their infrastructure and testing their techniques. I climbed to a high ridge and looked out over the mountains, and what I saw filled me with despair. In every direction, I could see areas of unnatural stillness, patches of forest where no wind moved the trees, where no birds flew, where the very air seemed frozen in place. The harvest had already begun. From my vantage point, I could see the entities moving throughout their collection network, no longer hiding their activities. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, working with coordinated precision to extract every bit of acoustic energy from the environment. But they weren't just taking the sounds themselves, they were taking the potential for sound, the very medium through which vibrations traveled. The air in the silent zones was becoming something else, a substance that couldn't carry sound waves, couldn't support the acoustic processes that life depended on. I watched in horror as wildlife fled the expanding zones, but many animals didn't move fast enough. Birds fell from the sky when they entered areas where the air could no longer support their echolocation or communication calls. Mammals wandered in confused circles, their acoustic senses disrupted by the changing properties of their environment. The entities noticed my observation and responded with increased activity. More figures appeared, moving with urgent purpose toward my position. They had decided I was a threat to their operation, despite my earlier refusal to cooperate. I scrambled down from the ridge, trying to reach the shrinking areas of normal space where sound still functioned. But the zones were collapsing inward, creating a maze of acoustic dead zones that herded me toward the entity's main collection facility. The facility itself was beyond my comprehension, a structure that existed partially in our dimension and partially in theirs, visible only as distortions in the air and strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. It thrummed with collected sound energy, processing the acoustic harvest and preparing it for transport to their home dimension. I found myself standing at the entrance to this impossible building, faced with entities that were no longer bothering to maintain their quasi-human appearance. They were revealed as what they truly were, crystalline constructs of living sound, beings whose very existence was based on acoustic principles foreign to our reality. The lead entity, larger and more complex than the others, communicated directly with my mind. It showed me visions of their home dimension, a reality where sound had substance, where acoustic waves formed landscapes and civilizations. Their world was dying, their sound matter depleting, and they had come to ours out of desperate necessity. They offered me the same choice as before, but with new urgency. Help them complete their harvest in a way that left some pockets of normal space for human survival, or watch as they stripped our entire dimension bare of acoustic energy. But I had seen enough to understand that there was no middle ground. Their needs were too great, their technology too powerful. Any compromise would only delay the inevitable extinction of sound in our world. I made a decision that I knew would cost me everything. Instead of choosing between their options, I chose a third path. I began to sing. It sounds ridiculous, but singing was the one thing their collection apparatus couldn't handle efficiently. The complex harmonics and emotional resonances of human vocal music created interference patterns in their equipment, disrupting the careful acoustic balance they needed to maintain. My voice, rough and untrained as it was, began to destabilize the collection facility. The entities reacted with alarm, their crystalline structures resonating in ways that created feedback loops throughout their network. The zones of silence began to fluctuate, their boundaries becoming unstable. Other sounds began to return, wind through the trees, the calls of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The natural acoustic environment was reasserting itself, fighting back against the artificial silence. The entities tried to stop me, but their intervention only made the situation worse. Their attempts to dampen my voice created more interference, more disruption to their carefully orchestrated system. The feedback loop spread throughout their collection network, causing failures in zones across the entire region. I sang until my voice gave out, then continued humming, whistling, making any sound I could produce. Around me, the impossible structure of the collection facility began to collapse, its acoustic foundations undermined by the chaos I had introduced. The entities were forced to choose between preserving their network and preserving themselves. They chose survival, abandoning their collection apparatus and retreating to their home dimension. The zones of silence collapsed like popped balloons, releasing all the captured sound energy in a wave of acoustic chaos that rolled across the mountains. The aftermath was devastating but brief. Trees creaked and swayed as sound returned to their branches. Birds resumed their calling, their voices hoarse and strange after the enforced silence. The natural acoustic ecosystem of the North Cascades slowly began to restore itself. But the damage had been done. Large areas of the forest showed the effects of prolonged acoustic deprivation, trees with stunted growth, clearings where wildlife had fled and never returned, and scattered patches where the air still didn't quite carry sound the way it should. I made it back to the ranger station 3 days later, my voice completely gone, my hearing permanently altered by exposure to the acoustic chaos of the facility's collapse. The official report blamed the incidents on unusual weather patterns that had created acoustic anomalies throughout the region. But I knew the truth, and I knew it wasn't over. The entities hadn't been destroyed, just driven off. They were still out there in their dying dimension, still desperate for the acoustic energy they needed to survive. And our world was still the richest source of that energy they had found. They would be back, with better technology, more sophisticated collection methods, and a deeper understanding of how to exploit our reality without triggering the kind of resistance I had provided. Next time, they wouldn't underestimate the power of human vocal music to disrupt their operations. I requested a transfer to a desk job, but the Park Service needed experienced wilderness rangers in the Cascades. Too many strange incidents were being reported throughout the region, areas where hikers reported feeling disoriented, zones where electronic equipment malfunctioned, and patches of forest that seemed somehow wrong to visitors. I knew what these reports really meant. The entities had left behind traces of their presence, acoustic scars that would take decades to heal completely. Some areas might never fully recover, remaining permanently altered by their harvesting operations. I've been documenting these sites, mapping the lingering effects of the entity presence and monitoring them for signs of renewed activity. It's not an official assignment. The Park Service doesn't acknowledge that anything unusual happened, but someone needs to watch for their return. Because they will return. The silence in the forest was just the beginning, their first tentative probe of our reality's acoustic resources. Next time, they'll be more careful, more subtle, and much more dangerous. I've started teaching other rangers to recognize the signs, the gradual dimming of natural sounds, the disorientation that comes from acoustic deprivation, and most importantly, the power of human voice to disrupt their technology. It's not much, but it's all we have. The sound in the Cascades has returned, but it's different now. There are harmonics that weren't there before, frequencies that seem to carry meaning beyond normal communication. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can hear echoes of the entity network, faint transmissions from their dimension that suggest they haven't given up their interest in our world. I've learned to sleep with music playing, to keep my environment filled with the complex acoustic patterns that make their collection efforts more difficult. It's become second nature now, this constant vigilance against the return of silence. Other wilderness areas are reporting similar incidents, zones of acoustic anomaly in national parks across the country. The entities aren't limiting themselves to the Cascades, they're conducting exploratory operations throughout our dimension, testing different environments and refining their techniques. The war for sound has begun, and most people don't even know they're fighting it. Every song sung, every conversation held, every noise made is a small act of resistance against the encroaching silence. I know I can't stop them permanently. Their needs are too great, their technology too advanced. But I can make it difficult for them, cost them time and resources, maybe buy humanity enough time to develop our own defenses. The Rangers in the Cascades have a new mission now, though it's never officially acknowledged. We're the guardians of sound itself, protectors of the acoustic environment that makes life as we know it possible. The silence is still out there, waiting in dimensions we can barely imagine. But as long as there are voices to sing, instruments to play, and people willing to make noise in defiance of the quiet, we'll keep fighting. The sound in the Cascades must never be allowed to die completely. It's not just about preserving wilderness, it's about preserving the very medium through which consciousness communicates with reality. And every day, I listen for the signs of their return, ready to sing again if necessary, ready to fill the silence with whatever sound I can create. Because in the end, that's all we have, our voices raised against the infinite quiet of a universe that would rather not hear us at all. My name is Jake Morrison, and before that Tuesday in September, I thought I understood Crystal Lake. I'd been the head ranger there for 12 years, ever since I got out of the Marines and decided I wanted a quiet life surrounded by nature instead of the chaos I'd left behind in Afghanistan. Crystal Lake seemed perfect, 15,000 acres of pristine wilderness in northern Minnesota, with a jewel of a lake at its center that reflected the sky like a mirror. I should have paid more attention to why it was called Crystal Lake. Should have wondered why the water was so impossibly clear, so deep, so still. Should have asked why the local Ojibwe tribe had always avoided it. The first sign something was wrong came during my routine water quality testing in early September. I'd been doing the same tests every month for over a decade: pH levels, dissolved oxygen, temperature readings at various depths. The lake had always been remarkably stable, its ecosystem perfectly balanced. But that September, something had changed. The pH was off, shifted toward alkaline in a way that made no scientific sense. The dissolved oxygen levels were through the roof, as if something was actively producing it deep beneath the surface. And the temperature readings, those made me check my equipment 3 times before I believed them. At the surface, Crystal Lake was a comfortable 72 degrees. But as I lowered my temperature probe deeper, the readings climbed instead of dropped. By the time I reached the 40-foot mark, the water was 85 degrees. At 60 feet, it was 95. And when I hit the probe's maximum depth of 100 feet, the temperature reading was 105 degrees. That was impossible. Lakes don't work that way. Heat rises, cold sinks. It's basic physics. I sent the readings to the state environmental office and waited for their explanation. What I got back was a form letter suggesting I recalibrate my equipment. But I knew my equipment was fine. Just like I knew something was very wrong with Crystal Lake. The second sign came a week later, when the fish started behaving strangely. Crystal Lake had always been a fisherman's paradise, home to some of the biggest walleye and northern pike in the state. The lake's clarity meant you could watch the fish swim in the shallows, and over the years, I'd gotten to know their patterns, their seasonal behaviors. But that September, the fish stopped coming to the shallows entirely. I'd stand on the dock at the boat launch and peer into water that was crystal clear for 15 or 20 feet down, and see nothing. No minnows, no bass, no sunfish. The lake looked dead, sterile, like a massive swimming pool. The strange part was that the fish were still there. Anglers continued to report good catches, but only in the deep water, only with heavy tackle that could reach the bottom. And the fish they brought up looked different. Paler than usual, with eyes that seemed too large for their heads. Some of the walleye had growths on their fins that looked almost like fingers, and the pike had developed rows of extra teeth that made their mouths look like bear traps. I collected specimens and sent them to the state fisheries department. They came back with clean bills of health, no signs of disease or pollution. But I'd been looking at fish for 12 years, and I knew what I was seeing wasn't normal. The third sign was the dreams. They started the night after I first took the temperature readings, vivid nightmares that felt more real than waking life. I would dream that I was swimming in Crystal Lake, diving deeper and deeper through water that grew warmer as I descended. The pressure should have crushed me, but instead it felt welcoming, like being embraced by something vast and ancient. In the dreams, I could breathe underwater. The lake would fill my lungs, but instead of drowning, I would feel more alive than ever. And as I swam deeper, would see lights in the darkness, not electric lights, but something organic, bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. The lights were beautiful, hypnotic, and they spelled out words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They told me stories about the time before time, when the world was young and the old gods swam in seas that covered continents. They whispered about cycles of awakening and sleeping, about the deep places where ancient things waited for the stars to align. And they called to me. Every night, they called me down into the warm depths of Crystal Lake. I started taking sleeping pills, but the dreams broke through anyway. I tried staying awake, but exhaustion would eventually drag me under, and there they would be waiting, the lights, the voices, the warm embrace of impossible water. After 2 weeks of dreams, I started noticing changes when I was awake. My appetite disappeared almost entirely. Food tasted like ash, and even water seemed wrong unless it came from Crystal Lake itself. I found myself making excuses to visit the lake during my rounds, not to do any official business, just to stand at the water's edge and stare into those crystal-clear depths. My skin began to change too. It started as dry patches on my arms and legs, areas that no amount of lotion could soften. But when I looked closer, the dryness wasn't random, it formed patterns, scales that overlapped like fish skin. And my eyes. Christ, my eyes were the worst part. They'd always been brown, a muddy hazel that my ex-wife used to say looked like tree bark. But as the weeks went on, they began to lighten, shifting toward green, then blue, then a pale silver that reflected light like Crystal Lake itself. I called in sick and drove to the clinic in town, but the doctor found nothing wrong. My blood work was perfect, my vital signs were strong, and according to every test he could run, I was in the best health of my life. But I knew better. I could feel something growing inside me, changing me, preparing me for something I didn't understand. The fourth sign was the visitors. They started showing up in mid-October, drawn to Crystal Lake by dreams they couldn't explain. A family from Iowa who'd driven 8 hours because the father had dreamed about fishing in impossibly clear water. A group of college students from Wisconsin who'd changed their weekend plans because one of them had seen the lake in a vision during a chemistry lecture. They all told the same story, vivid dreams of Crystal Lake, of swimming in warm water, of lights in the depths that called to them like sirens. And they all left changed. The family from Iowa spent 3 days camping at the lake. When they checked out, their youngest daughter, a girl of maybe 8, had developed gills. Functional gills, fluttering on the sides of her neck as she breathed. Her parents didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They just loaded up their car and drove away, the little girl pressing her face to the window as they left, staring back at the lake with eyes that had gone silver. The college students were worse. They'd arrived as normal 20-somethings, loud and drunk and full of life. But after a night swimming in Crystal Lake, they became quiet, contemplative, spending their days sitting at the water's edge and staring into the depths. When they finally left, they moved differently, their bodies undulating like they were still underwater. I should have closed the park. Should have called in the state authorities, the CDC, someone who could explain what was happening to Crystal Lake and everyone who came into contact with it. But I didn't want to. The dreams had become too strong, too seductive. They promised understanding, evolution, transformation into something greater than human. And deep down, in a part of my mind that was no longer entirely my own, I wanted to see what I was becoming. The answer came on Halloween night. I was doing a final patrol before locking up the park for the season when I saw the lights under the water. Not the bioluminescent patterns from my dreams, but actual lights, dozens of them, moving in formation like a procession or a ceremony. I grabbed my diving gear from the ranger station and suited up without really thinking about what I was doing. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but it was drowned out by the song coming from beneath the water, a harmony of voices that spoke directly to my bones. The water was warmer than body temperature as I descended, and I could feel it seeping through my wetsuit, caressing my transformed skin like a lover's touch. My vision, changed by weeks of dreams and mutation, could see clearly in the depths where no human eye should have been able to penetrate. What I saw at the bottom of Crystal Lake redefined my understanding of reality. There was a city down there. Not ruins of some ancient civilization, but a living, thriving metropolis that existed in the space between the lake bottom and some deeper dimension I couldn't comprehend. The architecture was organic, grown rather than built, with structures that pulsed and breathed like living tissue. Bioluminescent coral formations provided light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly because they contained too much meaning, too much truth about the nature of existence. And the inhabitants. They had once been human, I could tell that much. But they had evolved, transformed by their time in the deep places. Their bodies were elongated and graceful, adapted for life underwater. Gills fluttered along their necks and ribs. Their fingers were webbed, ending in claws that could grip the coral structures. And their eyes were like mine had become, silver and reflective, holding depths that suggested intelligence far beyond human understanding. They welcomed me like a long-lost brother. "Come down," they sang without words, their voices harmonizing in frequencies that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my soul. "Come down and be transformed. Come down and become what you were always meant to be." I tried to resist, tried to swim back to the surface, but my body wouldn't obey. The changes that had been building for weeks were accelerating, and I could feel my lungs adapting, learning to extract oxygen from water instead of air. The beings of the deep city surrounded me, their touch gentle but irresistible. They showed me visions of the world as it truly was, a thin veneer of land floating on vast oceans that contained civilizations older than human history. They showed me the network of underground rivers and lake systems that connected every body of water on Earth, highways for things that had never needed to breathe air or feel sunlight. They showed me my purpose. I was to be a herald, a bridge between the surface world and the deep places. The climate was changing, they explained, the ice caps melting, the sea levels rising. Soon, the old boundaries between land and water would disappear, and humanity would need guides to help them adapt to the new world. Guides like me. Like the others who had been called to Crystal Lake and transformed. The process took 3 days. I floated in the warm depths while my body completed its metamorphosis. My lungs developed secondary chambers that could process water. My skin grew a protective layer of scales. My bones became hollow and flexible, designed for life under pressure. And my mind expanded, connecting to the vast network of consciousness that linked every transformed being in every lake, river, and ocean on Earth. When the divers found me floating on the surface, I had been reborn. They pulled me out, performed CPR, rushed me to the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain how I'd survived 3 days underwater, how my body temperature had remained stable, how my brain showed no signs of oxygen deprivation. They ran tests, took samples, asked endless questions. But the equipment couldn't detect what I'd become, and I wasn't about to tell them. How could they understand? They were still bound by the limitations of air-breathing, land-walking existence. I was something more. The Park Service gave me medical leave while I recovered from my near-drowning experience. They expected trauma, PTSD, a fear of water that would end my career as a ranger. Instead, I felt a calm certainty about what came next. Crystal Lake is closed for the winter now, but that doesn't matter. The transformation has spread to other bodies of water throughout the region. Lake Superior shows the same temperature anomalies I first detected. The Mississippi River is calling to people in their dreams. And every day, more of the chosen ones arrive, drawn by visions they can't explain to water that promises to make them whole. I help them understand. I guide them through the change. The surface world thinks it's dealing with isolated incidents, strange drownings, unexplained disappearances, reports of people developing unusual physical characteristics after swimming in certain lakes and rivers. They don't see the pattern yet, don't understand that this is evolution in action. But they will. When the ice caps finish melting and the coastlines redraw themselves, when the old world drowns and the new one rises from the depths, they'll understand. The transformed will be there to help them adapt, to teach them how to breathe water and swim in the deep places. And it all started here, in Crystal Lake, where the boundary between dimensions is thin enough for the old ones to reach through and touch our world. I still live in my cabin on the shore, still carry the title of park ranger. But my real work happens at night, when I slip into the warm embrace of the lake and swim down to the impossible city that exists in the spaces between spaces. There, I take my place among the council of the transformed, and we plan for the day when all the world's waters will sing the same song, when every lake will be as clear as crystal, and when humanity will finally understand its true destiny lies not in the sky, but in the depths. The change is coming. The waters are rising. And we who swim in the deep places are ready to guide you home. My name is David Coleman, and for 6 months, I thought I was the apex predator in 80,000 acres of Oregon wilderness. I was wrong. I wasn't even close to the top of the food chain. Ravens Hollow isn't like other national parks. There are no crowds of tourists, no gift shops, no scenic overlooks marked with bronze plaques. It's too remote, too difficult to access, and frankly, too dangerous for casual visitors. The park exists primarily as a research preserve, a place where scientists can study old-growth forest ecosystems without human interference. Which made it perfect for someone like me, someone who needed to disappear for a while. I'd taken the job after my discharge from the Army Rangers, after 3 tours in places where I'd learned to kill efficiently and quietly. The VA doctors called it PTSD, but I knew better. Some people come back from war carrying their demons with them. Others come back as demons themselves. Ravens Hollow was supposed to be my sanctuary, my place to relearn what it meant to be human again. The job posting had made it clear: minimal human contact, long periods of solitude, responsibility for monitoring and protecting an ecosystem that had existed unchanged for thousands of years. What the posting hadn't mentioned was what else lived in those ancient woods. The ranger station was a log cabin built in the 1940s, updated with modern communications equipment but otherwise unchanged from the day it was constructed. It sat in a clearing at the geographic center of the park, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that became impassable during the winter months. I'd been living there for exactly 3 days when the scratching started. It began as a soft sound in the walls, like mice or squirrels nesting in the insulation. I'd lived in enough remote locations to know that rodents were a fact of life in wilderness areas, so I set out some traps and figured the problem would solve itself. But the scratching didn't sound like rodents. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. And it only happened at night, starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, 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 scratch. Pause. Scratch. After a week of sleepless nights, I decided to investigate. I pulled apart a section of wall in the main room, expecting to find evidence of mice or maybe bats. Instead, I found something that made me question my sanity. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols carved into the wooden frame of the cabin with something sharp enough to cut through oak. The marks were old, decades old, judging by the weathering, but they continued in neat rows across every beam, every support post, every piece of structural wood I could access. And they weren't made by animals. The scratches were too precise, too intentional. They looked like tally marks, as if someone had been counting something for years, maybe decades. But counting what? I radioed the regional office in Portland and asked about the station's history. Had there been problems with vandalism? Previous rangers reporting unusual activities? The response was vague and unhelpful. Ravens Hollow had a reputation for being hard on rangers, they admitted. High turnover rate, people requesting transfers after short assignments. But nothing specific, nothing that would explain the systematic carving I'd found in the walls. I should have pressed for more information. Should have demanded to know why 5 rangers had quit in the past 3 years, why the position had been vacant for 8 months before I'd taken it. Instead, I decided to solve the mystery myself. The first clue came from the park's research files. Ravens Hollow had been the subject of several ecological studies over the decades, most of them focused on the unusually diverse wildlife population. The forest was home to species that shouldn't coexist, predators and prey living in unusual harmony, migration patterns that made no scientific sense, breeding behaviors that defied conventional understanding. One study from 1987 had documented the presence of wolf packs in areas where wolves had been extinct for over a century. Another from 1994 described bear populations that remained active year-round instead of hibernating. And a more recent study from 2018 had tracked the movements of mountain cats that seemed to hunt in coordinated groups like a military unit. But it was the oldest study that caught my attention, a 1952 report filed by a research team from Oregon State University. They'd come to Ravens Hollow to study what they called anomalous predation patterns, and had left after only 2 weeks, their research incomplete and their final report heavily redacted. What hadn't been redacted was disturbing enough. The predatory behaviors observed in Ravens Hollow exceed normal parameters for known species. Pack coordination suggests intelligence levels inconsistent with current taxonomical classifications. Recommend immediate cessation of field work pending further consultation with. The rest was blacked out, but the implication was clear. Something in Ravens Hollow was too smart, too organized, too dangerous for normal research protocols. I started paying closer attention to the wildlife around the station. During my daily patrols, I began noticing things that the research reports had only hinted at. Animal tracks that appeared overnight in perfect geometric patterns around the cabin. Birds that flew in formations that resembled military reconnaissance flights. And the eyes, always the eyes, watching from the tree line with an intelligence that made my combat-trained instincts scream warnings. The scratching in the walls grew more intense. What had started as soft, rhythmic sounds became aggressive gouging that shook the entire cabin. I could hear the claws, and I was certain now that they were claws, working their way through the log walls with methodical precision. Whatever was making the sounds was getting closer to breaking through. I reinforced the walls with steel mesh and industrial adhesive, but the scratching adapted, moving to new sections, always staying one step ahead of my defenses. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with ordinary animals. The breakthrough came during my 3rd week at Ravens Hollow, when I decided to stay awake all night and track the source of the scratching. I positioned myself in the main room with night vision goggles and my service rifle, determined to get answers. At exactly midnight, the scratching began. But this time, I could see what was making it. Fingers. Human fingers, impossibly elongated and ending in claws that could cut through wood like butter. They emerged from gaps in the log walls that were too small for any living thing to fit through, stretching and twisting as they carved their tally marks into the wooden beams. The fingers worked with surgical precision, each scratch deliberate and measured. And as I watched in frozen horror, I realized what they were counting. Days. They were counting days. The older marks, weathered and faded, numbered in the thousands. Someone, or something, had been imprisoned in the walls of the ranger station for decades, scratching off each day of captivity like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. But who could survive sealed inside solid log walls? And what kind of creature could extend limbs through gaps barely wide enough for insects? I got my answer the next morning, when I found the journal. It was hidden in a cavity behind the fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. The leather cover was stained with something that might have been blood, and the pages were filled with the shaky handwriting of someone pushed beyond the limits of sanity. The journal belonged to Thomas Hartwell, a park ranger who'd been stationed at Ravens Hollow in 1973. His final entry was dated November 15, 50 years ago almost to the day. Entry number 127, November 15, 1973. They're not animals. God help me, they're not animals. I know what they are now. I know why the Klamath tribe abandoned this valley centuries ago, why they warned the first white settlers to stay away. They called them the Wendat Kasha, the hungry ghosts. Humans who stayed too long in the deep woods, who let the isolation and the darkness change them into something else. The scratching isn't coming from outside the walls. It's coming from the spaces between spaces, the places where the Wendat Kasha live when they're not hunting. They can compress their bodies, fold themselves into dimensions that shouldn't exist, hide in the gaps between reality and nightmare. But they're still hungry. They're always hungry. I thought I could fight them. I was a Marine, goddammit. I survived 2 tours in Vietnam. But you can't fight something that can become smoke when you try to shoot it, that can reach through solid walls to touch your face while you're sleeping. They've been testing me for months. Little touches at first, moving things around the cabin, scratching their marks to let me know they're watching. Now they're getting bolder. Last night, one of them tried to pull me through a crack in the wall no wider than my thumb. I can feel myself changing. The isolation is doing something to my mind, making me see things differently. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, my reflection looks hungry. And I've started having dreams about hunting, about the taste of fear. I think that's how it works. They don't just kill you, they transform you. Turn you into one of them. Another Wendat Kasha to haunt the deep woods. I've sealed the cabin as best I can, but I know it won't hold them forever. They're patient. They've been waiting in these woods for centuries. They can wait a little longer. If someone finds this journal, don't try to help me. I'm already lost. Just burn the cabin and get out of Raven's Hollow before the sun sets. The Wendat Kasha hunt at night, and they're always looking for new additions to their pack. The scratching has stopped. They're coming. That was the last entry. I spent the rest of the day researching the Klamath tribal legends, using the satellite internet connection to dig into historical records and anthropological studies. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The Wendat Kasha were real. According to tribal oral histories, they had been human once, hunters and warriors who had ventured too deep into the old forests and stayed too long. The isolation and the primal darkness of the deep woods had stripped away their humanity, leaving behind creatures that existed somewhere between the physical and spiritual worlds. They could compress their bodies to fit through impossibly small spaces, fold themselves into the gaps between dimensions. They fed on fear and loneliness, drawing sustenance from the terror of isolated humans. And worst of all, they reproduced by transformation, turning their victims into new Wendat Kasha through prolonged exposure to their influence. The tribal elders had sealed Raven's Hollow Valley centuries ago, using rituals and barriers that kept the Wendat Kasha trapped in the deepest parts of the forest. But the arrival of white settlers and the establishment of the national park had broken those ancient protections. Now the Wendat Kasha were free to hunt again. I should have left Raven's Hollow that day. Should have called in a medical emergency, requested immediate evacuation, anything to get away from the cabin and the things that hunted in its walls. But Thomas Hartwell's journal had mentioned something else, something that made leaving impossible. The Wendat Kasha didn't just stay in Raven's Hollow. They could travel through the network of old forests that connected national parks across the Pacific Northwest. If they were hunting again, if their numbers were growing, they could spread to other wilderness areas, other isolated ranger stations. I was a soldier before I became a ranger. I'd sworn an oath to protect people, and that oath didn't end just because I'd changed uniforms. I decided to fight. The next week was a crash course in warfare unlike anything they'd taught me in the army. The Wendat Kasha were intelligent opponents who adapted their tactics based on my defenses. When I reinforced the walls, they found new ways to reach through. When I set up motion sensors, they learned to move between the gaps in detection. When I established a perimeter of lights around the cabin, they began hunting during the brief moments when clouds blocked the moon. But they had weaknesses. Fire drove them back, the flames disrupting whatever dimensional folding allowed them to compress their bodies. Salt created barriers they couldn't cross, the mineral somehow interfering with their ability to phase between spaces. And iron, cold iron, forged in the old ways, could actually wound them, force them back into fully physical forms where they could be fought conventionally. I turned the ranger station into a fortress. Salt lines at every entrance, iron mesh reinforcing the walls, and a rotating system of fires that kept the perimeter lit throughout the night. My military training kicked in, and I fell back on the discipline that had kept me alive in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Wendat Kasha responded by escalating their attacks. They began hunting in packs, coordinating their assaults like the intelligent predators they'd become. While one distracted me at the front of the cabin, others would test the rear defenses. They learned to mimic human voices, calling for help from the darkness to lure me outside the protective barriers. And they brought reinforcements. The scratching in the walls multiplied, becoming a symphony of claws working in perfect harmony. I could hear them moving through the spaces between the logs, dozens of them now, maybe hundreds. The tally marks they carved grew more elaborate, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. But the worst part was the dreams. Every time I managed to fall asleep, I found myself in a place that wasn't quite the forest and wasn't quite the spirit world. The Wendat Kasha were there, moving through twisted trees that grew in impossible directions. They showed me visions of what I could become if I stopped fighting, if I let the isolation and the darkness transform me. I could join their pack, they whispered. I could hunt without the burden of human morality, feed on fear without the weakness of empathy. All I had to do was open the door, step outside the protective barriers, and let them complete the process that had already begun. Because it had begun. I could feel it every morning when I looked in the mirror, see it in the way my reflection seemed to flicker at the edges. The prolonged exposure to the Wendat Kasha was changing me, just as it had changed Thomas Hartwell, just as it had changed all the rangers who'd come before me. I was running out of time. The solution came from an unexpected source, a follow-up report to the 1952 research study, filed in 1954 by a team of anthropologists working with Klamath tribal elders. They'd developed a ritual, a way to not just ward off the Wendat Kasha but to send them back to whatever dimensional prison they'd escaped from. It required three things: a willing sacrifice, a complete understanding of what the Wendat Kasha truly were, and the destruction of their anchor point in the physical world. The ranger station was their anchor point. The decades of tally marks carved into its walls had created a connection between the physical and spiritual realms, a gateway that allowed the Wendat Kasha to move freely between dimensions. As long as the cabin stood, they would continue to hunt, continue to transform isolated humans into new members of their pack. The cabin had to be destroyed. But the ritual required a willing sacrifice, someone who understood the true nature of the Wendat Kasha and was prepared to stay behind to ensure the gateway was properly sealed. Someone like me. I spent my last night at Raven's Hollow preparing for the ritual. I gathered the materials specified in the anthropological report: white sage for purification, cedar bark for protection, and a circle of stones arranged according to Klamath tradition. I loaded my gear with enough explosives to level the cabin and everything within a 100-yard radius. And I wrote my own journal entry, a record of what I'd learned and what I was about to do. Entry number 1, November 15, 2023, exactly 50 years after Thomas Hartwell's final entry. The Wendat Kasha are not just predators. They're a form of spiritual infection, a contamination that spreads through isolation and fear. Every person who stays alone in the deep woods for too long becomes vulnerable to their influence. Every ranger station, every remote cabin, every isolated outpost becomes a potential anchor point for their hunting grounds. I understand now why the turnover rate is so high among wilderness rangers, why so many of us request transfers or simply disappear. We're not just protecting the forests from people, we're protecting people from the things that hunt in the deepest, darkest places. The ritual will send them back, but someone has to stay to complete it. Someone has to hold the gateway closed while the anchor point is destroyed. The Klamath elders called this person the Watcher, the guardian who stands between worlds to keep the ancient hungers from spilling into our reality. I volunteered for this duty when I took the oath to protect and serve. I just didn't know what I was volunteering for. If you find this journal, don't mourn for me. I made peace with death a long time ago, in places where bullets and bombs taught me that survival is borrowed time. At least this death means something. At least this sacrifice protects others. The sun is setting. The ritual begins at midnight. Tell my story. Warn the others. And whatever you do, don't try to rebuild the ranger station. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. The ritual worked. At exactly midnight, as the Wendat Kasha emerged from their dimensional hiding places for a final assault on the cabin, I detonated the explosives. The ranger station disappeared in a ball of fire and force that lit up the night sky for miles around. But I didn't die. Instead, I found myself in the space between spaces, standing guard at the dimensional gateway as it slowly sealed itself closed. The Wendat Kasha fought against the closing portal, their claws reaching desperately for the physical world they were being banished from. I held the line. One by one, they were pulled back into the darkness they'd escaped from centuries ago. Their hunting grounds collapsed, their anchor points in reality severed. The scratching in the walls of remote cabins across the Pacific Northwest fell silent as the Wendat Kasha were forced back into their prison. When the last of them disappeared and the gateway finally closed, I expected to follow them into whatever dimension lay beyond. Instead, I found myself back in the physical world, standing in the smoldering ruins of the ranger station as dawn broke over Raven's Hollow. But I wasn't unchanged. I could see the spaces between spaces now, the hidden paths the Wendat Kasha had used to move between worlds. I could sense when the barriers grew thin, when other ancient hungers stirred in the deep places. And I understood that my job wasn't finished. There are other anchor points, other ranger stations where isolated humans stand guard against things they don't understand. Other wilderness areas where the boundaries between worlds grow thin and predators from forgotten dimensions test their prison walls. I travel between them now, a different kind of ranger protecting a different kind of wilderness. I watch for the signs, scratching in walls, tally marks carved in wood, rangers who request transfers after reporting unusual wildlife behavior. And when I find evidence of the Wendat Kasha or their kin, I do what needs to be done. The official report listed the destruction of Raven's Hollow Ranger Station as a gas leak explosion. My death was recorded as a tragic accident, another casualty of the dangerous work rangers face in remote locations. But I'm not dead. I'm something else now, something between human and watcher, standing guard at the borders of reality to keep the ancient hungers from spilling into our world. The deep woods are full of dark things, creatures that hunt in the spaces between thought and nightmare. Most people never see them, never need to know they exist. But for those who do encounter them, for the rangers and researchers and unlucky hikers who stumble into hunting grounds older than civilization, I'll be there. Watching. Waiting. Ready to hold the line between worlds. Because someone has to stand guard in the deep places. And the scratching in the walls has to be answered. My name is Rebecca Cross, and for 8 months, I was the sole ranger responsible for 23,000 acres of Appalachian wilderness in eastern Tennessee. Thornfield Ridge isn't like the popular national parks. It's a forgotten place, a tract of old-growth forest that the government acquired in the 1960s and then seemed to forget about. No visitor centers, no marked trails, no amenities for tourists who want to experience nature without getting their hands dirty. It's exactly the kind of assignment I'd been looking for after my divorce, after the custody battle, after everything in my old life fell apart. A place where I could disappear for a while and remember who I was before I became someone's ex-wife and someone else's absent mother. Thornfield Ridge was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it became my nightmare. The ridge gets its name from the massive hawthorn trees that grow along its spine, their branches twisted into shapes that look like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Local folklore says the trees grew from the blood of Cherokee warriors who died fighting white settlers in the 1830s, but I'm not one for ghost stories. I prefer facts, evidence, things I can touch and measure and understand. Which is why finding that finger bone bothered me so much. I discovered it during my second week on the job, while conducting a wildlife survey along the eastern slope of the ridge. The bone was lying in a patch of disturbed earth, as if something had recently dug it up and left it there for me to find. I bagged it as evidence and made a note in my patrol log, figuring it was probably from a hiker who died decades ago, before the area became a protected forest. Mountain wilderness can be unforgiving, and it wasn't uncommon to find remains of people who'd gotten lost or injured far from help. But one bone led to another. Over the next few weeks, I found more scattered remains throughout the forest. Always single bones, never complete skeletons. A femur near the creek that ran through Devil's Hollow. A skull fragment caught in the roots of a massive pine tree. A ribcage scattered across a quarter-mile stretch of game trail. Each discovery followed the same pattern. The bones appeared overnight in places I'd patrolled the day before, always in spots where the earth looked recently disturbed, always positioned as if they'd been deliberately placed for me to find. I reported the discoveries to the state police, but they weren't much help. The bones were old, decades old, maybe longer, and there were no missing person reports that matched the timeline. Without soft tissue or personal effects, there was no way to identify the remains or determine cause of death. Probably just old graves getting disturbed by erosion, the detective told me over the phone. Mountain folk used to bury their dead wherever was convenient. Wouldn't be the first time weather uncovered somebody's great-great-grandfather. But I knew it was more than that. The bones weren't just appearing randomly, they were forming a pattern. I started mapping the locations where I found remains, marking each discovery on a topographical chart of the ridge. After 6 weeks and 37 bone fragments, the pattern became clear. The bones were arranged in a perfect spiral, starting at the base of the ridge and coiling upward toward the summit. Each fragment was positioned at a mathematically precise distance from the next, creating a spiral that followed the golden ratio with an accuracy that couldn't be coincidental. Someone, or something, was using human remains to create a massive geometric pattern across miles of wilderness. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it fascinated me. I'd studied archaeology in college before switching to forestry, and I'd seen similar spiral patterns in ancient sites around the world. Stone circles in Britain, medicine wheels in the American Southwest, megalithic arrangements that suggested our ancestors understood geometric principles were only beginning to rediscover. But those ancient spirals were made of stone, not human bones. And they were built by people who believed geometry could channel spiritual energy, who thought certain patterns could open doorways between worlds. What if the bones on Thornfield Ridge weren't just random remains? What if they were part of something much older and much more dangerous? I started researching the history of the area, digging through county records and genealogical archives, looking for clues about who might have lived on the ridge before it became protected land. What I found changed everything. Thornfield Ridge had been home to a religious community called the Order of the Eternal Garden, led by a man named Ezekiel Thornfield who'd moved his followers to the mountains in 1847. The order believed that death was an illusion, that the human soul could be preserved and cultivated like a plant in the right soil. According to contemporary accounts, Thornfield and his followers practiced a form of agriculture unlike anything seen before or since. They didn't grow crops or raise livestock. Instead, they planted human remains in carefully arranged patterns throughout the forest, believing that the decomposing bodies would nourish a spiritual harvest that would grant them immortality. The order had thrived for nearly 20 years before local authorities finally investigated reports of missing travelers and suspicious deaths. When the sheriff's posse reached the ridge in 1866, they found a community of over 200 people living among what could only be described as gardens of human bones. The official report was sanitized, but I found newspaper accounts that described the scene in horrifying detail. The order had arranged thousands of human remains in geometric patterns throughout the forest, creating vast mandalas of death that spiraled outward from a central point near the summit of the ridge. At the center of the largest spiral, they found Ezekiel Thornfield himself, very much alive despite being over 90 years old. The man claimed to have achieved immortality through his bone gardens, to have unlocked the secret of eternal life by feeding on the spiritual energy released by carefully arranged remains. The authorities burned the order's buildings and arrested the survivors, but Thornfield himself vanished into the deep woods. Some said he died in the forest, finally succumbing to old age. Others claimed he was still out there, tending his bone gardens and waiting for the right time to complete his work. The newspaper accounts ended there, but I found one more piece of evidence in the county courthouse, a surveyor's map from 1867 showing the location of the order's bone gardens. The patterns matched my own discoveries exactly. Someone was rebuilding Ezekiel Thornfield's bone gardens, using the same geometric principles, following the same spiral pattern that had been documented over 150 years ago. I should have called for backup then. Should have contacted the FBI, the state police, anyone with the authority and resources to investigate what was clearly an active crime scene involving multiple homicides. But I didn't. Because by then, I'd started having the dreams. They began the night after I found the surveyor's map, vivid visions that felt more real than waking life. I would dream that I was walking through a garden unlike any place on earth, where flowers bloomed from human skulls and trees grew bones instead of fruit. The air was thick with the smell of rich soil and decay, and everywhere I looked, geometric patterns of remains created mandala-like arrangements that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. At the center of the garden stood a man who could only be Ezekiel Thornfield. He was tall and thin, with wild white hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. His skin was pale and translucent, showing the network of veins beneath like a roadmap of mortality. "Welcome to the eternal garden," he would say, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transcended death itself. "You've been chosen to help complete the great work." In the dreams, I understood what he meant. The bone gardens weren't just random arrangements of remains, they were a form of spiritual technology, a way of channeling the energy released by decomposing organic matter and focusing it through geometric principles. Like a massive battery made of death, storing and concentrating the life force of hundreds of people. And it was almost complete. The spiral pattern I'd been mapping was just the outer edge of something much larger, a geometric arrangement that encompassed the entire ridge. When the last bone was placed in the correct position, when the pattern was finally complete, the stored energy would be released in a burst of power that would grant true immortality to anyone standing at the center. Ezekiel Thornfield had been working toward this moment for over 150 years, slowly rebuilding his bone gardens one fragment at a time, waiting for the right person to help him complete the pattern. He'd chosen me. The dreams grew stronger each night, more detailed, more seductive. Thornfield showed me visions of what immortality would mean, never growing old, never getting sick, never having to watch loved ones die while I remained helplessly mortal. I could see my daughter again, could be the mother I'd failed to be during the custody battle. I could have all the time in the world to repair the relationships I'd broken, to become the person I'd always wanted to be. All I had to do was help him place the final bones. I started sleepwalking. At least, that's what I told myself when I woke up in strange places throughout the forest, my hands dirty and my clothes torn from pushing through underbrush in the dark. But deep down, I knew it wasn't sleepwalking. I was being called to complete the pattern, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist to find and position the remaining bone fragments. Each morning, I would discover that another bone had appeared overnight in exactly the right location to continue the spiral. And each morning, would find evidence that I'd been the one to place it there, dirt under my fingernails, scratches on my arms from thorn bushes, footprints in the mud that matched my boots. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, tried to make me understand that I was being manipulated by something ancient and malevolent. But the dreams were so vivid, so convincing, that waking life began to feel like the illusion. I stopped reporting my discoveries to the authorities. Stopped maintaining my patrol logs. Stopped answering radio calls from the regional office. My entire existence narrowed to a single purpose, completing Ezekiel Thornfield's bone garden. 3 weeks after finding the surveyor's map, I placed the final bone. It was a child's skull, small and delicate, with tiny teeth still embedded in the jawbone. I found it at dawn on the summit of Thornfield Ridge, sitting on a flat stone that had been arranged like an altar. As soon as I touched it, I knew exactly where it belonged, at the very center of the spiral, the focal point where all the geometric lines converged. I carried it down the mountain to a clearing I'd never seen before, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by massive hawthorn trees. At the center of the clearing was a depression in the ground, exactly the right size and shape to hold a child's skull. As I placed the final bone in position, the entire forest went silent. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through the leaves. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had become thick and heavy with anticipation. Then the bones began to glow. It started as a faint phosphorescence, like the luminescence of decaying wood. But it grew brighter and more intense, until every fragment of human remains scattered throughout the forest burned with cold, white light. The spiral pattern became visible from above, a massive mandala of death that stretched across miles of wilderness. And at the center of it all, Ezekiel Thornfield stepped out of the shadows between the hawthorn trees. He was exactly as he'd appeared in my dreams, tall and pale, with wild white hair and eyes that held the weight of centuries. But seeing him in person, I realized how wrong I'd been about what he offered. This wasn't immortality. This was something much worse. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of a tomb. "You've completed the great work. The eternal garden is ready to bear fruit." The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I could hear something stirring in the earth around the clearing. The carefully arranged bones were sinking into the soil, taking root like seeds in fertile ground. And from each point where remains touched earth, something new began to grow. They weren't plants. They weren't trees. They were human forms, pale and translucent, sprouting from the ground like grotesque flowers. As they emerged, I recognized faces from old missing person posters, people who had vanished in the mountains over the past century and a half. The bone garden wasn't preserving life. It was harvesting it, using the arranged remains as anchor points to pull souls back from whatever lay beyond death. But these weren't resurrections. They were imprisonments, trapping human spirits in forms that were neither fully alive nor fully dead. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Thornfield said, watching his harvest emerge from the soil. "Death is just the beginning. In my garden, nothing is ever truly lost." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The compulsion that had driven me to complete the pattern still held me in its grip, and I could feel my own life force being drawn into the geometric arrangement I'd helped create. That's when I understood the truth. I hadn't been chosen to help Ezekiel Thornfield achieve immortality. I'd been chosen to be the final sacrifice, the keystone that would lock the pattern in place and give him power over life and death itself. The pale figures rising from the bone garden turned toward me with expressions of infinite hunger. They'd been trapped in Thornfield's spiritual prison for decades, maybe centuries, and they wanted company. They wanted me to join them in their eternal servitude. But I'd spent 2 tours in Iraq before becoming a forest ranger, and I'd learned something about fighting impossible odds. Sometimes the only way to win is to destroy the battlefield. I still carried emergency flares in my gear belt, standard equipment for signaling rescue helicopters in remote areas. As the harvested souls reached for me with grasping, translucent hands, I pulled the pin on every flare I had and threw them into the dry underbrush surrounding the clearing. The hawthorn trees caught fire immediately, their ancient wood burning with an intensity that seemed to feed on the supernatural energy saturating the area. The flame spread outward from the clearing, following the spiral pattern of bones like a fuse leading to a massive explosive. Thornfield screamed as his bone garden began to burn, the carefully arranged geometric pattern disrupted by the cleansing fire. The pale figures sank back into the earth, released from their imprisonment as the anchors that held them dissolved in the flames. You don't understand, Thornfield shouted over the roar of the fire. The garden is eternal. Death feeds life. Life feeds death. The cycle cannot be broken. But it could be broken. As the fire consumed the bones that had taken him over a century to arrange, Ezekiel Thornfield's immortality began to unravel. His pale skin grew even more translucent, his wild hair turned to ash, his century-old body finally succumbing to the mortality he'd cheated for so long. He collapsed as the flames reached the center of the clearing, his final words lost in the sound of burning trees and the screams of souls finally set free. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming over 5,000 acres of old-growth forest and destroying every trace of Thornfield's bone garden. The official investigation blamed a lightning strike for the blaze, and I was hailed as a hero for my heroic efforts to contain the spread despite being trapped in the middle of the fire zone. They had no idea how close I'd come to helping something ancient and evil complete a work that would have turned the entire Appalachian wilderness into a hunting ground for the undead. I transferred out of Thornfield Ridge as soon as the paperwork cleared, taking a position at a nice, safe, boring state park in Florida where the most dangerous thing I have to deal with is the occasional alligator. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the pine trees, I hear echoes of Ezekiel Thornfield's voice carried on the air. The garden is eternal. Death feeds life. Life feeds death. The cycle cannot be broken. And I wonder if destroying his bone garden was really enough, or if somewhere in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, new bones are being arranged in spiral patterns, waiting for the next person to complete the great work. The dead don't stay buried in places like Thornfield Ridge. They just wait for someone foolish enough to help them grow. My name is Michael Torres, and for 4 months, I thought I was managing 40,000 acres of pristine wetlands in the Louisiana Bayou. I was wrong. I was being managed by something much older and infinitely more patient than any human institution. Shadowmere isn't like other wildlife refuges. There are no boardwalks for tourists, no guided tours, no educational programs about migratory bird patterns. It's too remote, too dangerous, and frankly, too strange for public access. The refuge exists officially to protect rare species of wading birds and endangered plants that grow nowhere else on Earth. Unofficially, it exists to keep certain things contained. I took the job because I needed to disappear for a while. My previous position with the Forest Service had ended badly, accusations of negligence, whispered rumors about mental instability, and a forced resignation that had destroyed my career and my reputation. Shadowmere was the only place that would hire me, and I suspect that was only because no one else wanted the assignment. The refuge headquarters was a converted hunting lodge built on one of the few stable pieces of ground in the entire preserve, surrounded by miles of cypress swamp, Spanish moss, and water the color of coffee with too much cream. The nearest town was 40 miles away by boat, assuming you could navigate the maze of channels that wound through the wetlands. My predecessor had left detailed notes about the refuge's unique challenges: aggressive alligators that showed unusual intelligence, snakes that seemed to hunt in coordinated packs, and water levels that fluctuated according to no known tidal or seasonal patterns. But it was the final entry in his log that should have made me turn around and find another job. The eyes in the water are not alligators. Do not investigate. Do not attempt to photograph. Do not make direct eye contact. File all reports as unidentified wildlife and request no follow-up from regional office. Some things are better left alone. I found the entry cryptic and unprofessional, the kind of thing written by someone who'd spent too much time alone in the swamp and let isolation affect their judgment. I made a mental note to maintain better records and focus on scientifically verifiable phenomena. That resolution lasted exactly 3 days. I first saw the eyes while conducting a wildlife survey along the eastern edge of the refuge, using a shallow draft boat to navigate the narrow channels between stands of bald cypress. The water was unusually still, creating perfect reflections of the moss-draped trees and the pewter sky above. That's when I noticed them, 2 pale circles just beneath the surface, maybe 10 feet from the boat. They were perfectly round, about the size of dinner plates, and they glowed with a faint bioluminescence that reminded me of jellyfish or deep-sea creatures. At first, I thought they were some kind of plant, maybe a rare species of lily pad or fungus that had adapted to the unique conditions of the swamp. I grabbed my camera and leaned over the side of the boat for a better look. The eyes blinked. Not the slow, nictitating membrane of an alligator or the quick flutter of a bird's eyelid. This was a deliberate, intelligent blink that lasted exactly 3 seconds and conveyed a sense of ancient awareness that made my skin crawl. I jerked back from the water's edge and nearly capsized the boat. When I looked again, the eyes were gone, leaving only ripples on the surface to suggest they'd ever been there at all. I spent the rest of the day telling myself it had been an optical illusion, a trick of light and shadow on the dark water. But that night, alone in the headquarters lodge, I found myself obsessively reviewing the photographs I'd taken. The images showed nothing unusual, just dark water and cypress trees. But in one photo, if I enhanced the contrast and adjusted the brightness, I could make out a vague circular shape beneath the surface. It was too indistinct to be definitive proof, but it was there. More disturbing was what I found when I cross-referenced the location with historical survey maps. The area where I'd seen the eyes was marked on a 1934 survey as Watcher Pool, Do Not Disturb. Below that notation, in different handwriting, someone had added, sealed by Federal Order 1947. I started researching the history of Shadowmere, digging through government archives and old newspaper files. What I found painted a picture of a place that had been trouble long before it became a wildlife refuge. In the early 1900s, the area had been home to a Cajun community called Marais d'Yeux, the Marsh of Eyes. According to local folklore, the people of Marais d'Yeux had lived in harmony with something ancient that dwelt in the deepest parts of the swamp, something they called les gardiens, the Watchers. The Watchers were described as beings of vast intelligence and patience, entities that had existed in the bayou since before human memory. They were neither benevolent nor malevolent, but they demanded respect and adherence to certain rules. As long as the people of Marais d'Yeux honored the old agreements, the Watchers protected them from hurricanes, floods, and the other dangers of swamp life. But in 1943, everything changed. The federal government needed to establish a training facility for amphibious warfare, and they'd chosen the remote bayou of southern Louisiana as the perfect location. The people of Marais d'Yeux were forcibly relocated, their homes destroyed, and the ancient agreements with the Watchers were broken. What happened next was covered up in classified military reports, but I found fragments of the story in declassified documents and the testimony of survivors. The training exercises had awakened something in the deep water, something that killed with a precision and intelligence that defied explanation. Entire squads of soldiers vanished without a trace. Others were found floating face down in the swamp, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes had been replaced with pale, luminescent orbs that continued to watch even after death. The military abandoned the training facility after 3 months, but the damage was done. The Watchers had been disturbed, the old agreements broken, and they were no longer content to remain hidden in the deepest parts of the swamp. That's when the government created Shadowmere National Wildlife Refuge, not to protect endangered species, but to contain something that posed a threat to national security. The more I learned, the more I understood that my predecessors' warnings hadn't been the paranoid ramblings of an isolated man. They'd been hard-earned wisdom from someone who'd learned to coexist with forces beyond human comprehension. But understanding and accepting are two different things. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate further. I was a scientist, trained to observe and document natural phenomena. Whatever the watchers were, they were part of the ecosystem I'd been hired to manage. I had a responsibility to understand them. I started small, setting up remote cameras at various locations throughout the refuge. If the eyes were real, if something was moving through the water with intelligence and purpose, would capture evidence. The cameras worked for exactly one night. When I checked them the next morning, every single device had been removed from its mounting and placed in a neat row on the dock outside the headquarters lodge. The memory cards were missing, but the cameras themselves were undamaged, arranged with the lenses facing the building like a jury of electronic eyes. The message was clear: we see you, and we don't want to be seen. But I was too curious, too proud, too convinced of my own scientific rationality to heed the warning. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of covert surveillance, would attempt direct communication. If the watchers were intelligent, if they were capable of understanding human intentions, maybe I could establish some kind of dialogue. I spent a week preparing for the attempt, researching the old Cajun traditions and the agreements that had supposedly existed between the people of Marais de Dieu and their protectors. The historical accounts were vague, but they consistently mentioned certain rituals, offerings of food and handmade crafts, specific words spoken in Louisiana Creole, and most importantly, a demonstration of respect and non-hostile intent. On a muggy Thursday evening, as the sun set through the cypress canopy and painted the water the color of dried blood, I loaded my boat with offerings and paddled out to Watcher Pool. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a black mirror. Spanish moss hung from the cypress branches like funeral shrouds, and the only sounds were the distant calls of night birds and the gentle lap of water against my boat. I anchored in the center of the pool and began the ritual as I understood it, speaking the words I'd found in historical accounts. Gardiens de eaux profondes, I come with respect. I seek understanding, not dominion. I offer gifts in the old way. I placed the offerings in the water one by one, a hand-carved wooden figure I'd made from cypress wood, a jar of local honey, and a small bundle of sweetgrass that I'd learned was considered sacred by the original inhabitants. For several minutes, nothing happened. The water remained still, and I began to feel foolish for attempting to communicate with what was probably just an unusual species of fish or aquatic plant. Then the eyes appeared. Not just two this time, but dozens of them, rising from the depths of the pool like luminescent bubbles. They surrounded my boat in a perfect circle, each pair positioned exactly the same distance from the next, creating a geometric pattern that was too precise to be natural. The eyes were beautiful in a way that made my chest tight with inexplicable emotion. They pulsed with soft, rhythmic light that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, and as I stared into them, I began to understand that I was looking at something far more complex than I'd imagined. These weren't separate creatures. They were sensory organs of a single entity, a vast intelligence that existed throughout the entire swamp ecosystem. The individual eyes were like neurons in a massive brain, allowing the watchers to perceive events across thousands of acres simultaneously. And they were trying to communicate with me. The pulsing light began to form patterns, sequences of brightness and darkness that reminded me of Morse code or binary computer language. I didn't understand the specific meaning, but I could sense the emotional content, curiosity, caution, and something that might have been hope. I tried to respond, speaking aloud what I thought they wanted to hear. I understand you're protecting this place. I'm not here to harm or exploit. I just want to learn, to find a way we can coexist. The pattern of lights changed, becoming more complex, more urgent. And slowly, impossibly, I began to understand what they were trying to tell me. The Watchers weren't just protecting Shadowmere from human interference. They were protecting humanity from something else, something that lived even deeper in the swamp, something that the broken agreements of 1943 had partially awakened. The Cajuns of Marais de Dieu had been more than just residents of the bayou. They'd been guardians, maintaining rituals and agreements that kept ancient powers contained. When they were forcibly removed and their traditions destroyed, the delicate balance that had existed for centuries was shattered. Now the Watchers struggled alone to maintain barriers that required human participation to remain stable. They needed someone who understood the old ways, someone who could help restore the agreements that kept darker things sleeping in the deepest parts of the swamp. They needed a new guardian. As this understanding washed over me, the lights began to fade. One by one, the eyes sank back into the dark water, leaving me alone in my boat with the weight of knowledge I hadn't asked for. But they left me with more than just information. They left me with dreams. That night, and every night afterward, I dreamed of the deep places beneath Shadowmere. I saw vast chambers carved from living wood, filled with bioluminescent creatures that had never known sunlight. I witnessed the slow, patient work of entities that measured time in geological ages, maintaining seals and barriers that protected the surface world from things that should never be allowed to wake. And I saw what would happen if those barriers failed. The deeper entity that the Watchers contained wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It was simply too vast, too alien, too fundamentally incompatible with terrestrial life. If it woke fully, if it rose from the abyssal chambers where it had slept since before the continents took their current shape, its mere presence would transform the entire Gulf Coast ecosystem into something unrecognizable. The military exercises of 1943 had disturbed its slumber, caused it to stir and partially wake. Only the desperate efforts of the Watchers had prevented a full awakening, but they couldn't maintain the containment indefinitely without human assistance. I understood what they were asking of me, and I understood the choice I had to make. I could file a report classifying the lights as unidentified bioluminescent phenomena, request a transfer, and leave Shadowmere to whatever fate awaited it when the Watchers finally failed in their ancient duty. Or I could stay and learn to be the guardian they needed. The decision wasn't really a choice. I'd seen what lay sleeping in the deep places, and I couldn't walk away knowing that my absence might lead to its awakening. I spent the next 3 months learning the old ways. The Watchers were patient teachers, communicating through dreams and the patterns of light they created in the water. They showed me which offerings were needed and when, which words had power and which were merely sounds, which locations were sacred and which were too dangerous for human presence. I learned that the refuge wasn't just a collection of wetlands and wildlife, it was a living mandala, a geometric arrangement of waterways and land masses that channeled and contained forces I was only beginning to understand. Every channel, every island, every stand of cypress trees was positioned according to principles that predated human civilization. And maintaining that arrangement required constant vigilance. Some days, I would find that overnight storms had shifted debris in ways that disrupted the flow of energy through the system. I would spend hours moving fallen logs and clearing channels, following instructions that came to me in dreams or in the patient blinking of eyes beneath the water. Other days, would discover intrusions, animals or plants that didn't belong in the ecosystem, brought by currents or weather from outside areas. These had to be gently relocated before their presence could upset the delicate balance that kept the deep sleeper contained. and sometimes, on the worst days, would find evidence that the barriers were weakening. Dead fish with mutations that defied biological explanation. Water that glowed with phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. Plants that grew in impossible spirals, their roots reaching toward depths that shouldn't exist in a shallow swamp. When I found these signs, I knew the deep sleeper was stirring, testing the strength of its prison. Those were the days when I had to perform the most dangerous part of my new role, descending into the deep places myself to reinforce seals that could only be maintained by someone with human intelligence and will. The descent was always the same. I would wade into Watcher Pool as the sun set, following paths of light that only I could see, breathing water as if it were air once I passed a certain depth. The Watchers would guide me through chambers that existed in the spaces between reality and dream, showing me the massive form that slept at the heart of their prison. It was beautiful and terrible, a fusion of organic and crystalline structures that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. I could never look at it directly, the sight would have driven me insane, but I could sense its vastness, its alien intelligence, its frustrated desire to wake and transform the world according to its own incomprehensible vision. My job was to strengthen the barriers that contained it, using techniques that were part ritual, part science, and part pure faith. I would place my hands on crystalline formations that felt like frozen music and speak words in languages that had never been human, channeling my own life force into seals that had to be renewed by each generation of guardians. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and utterly necessary. But it was also transformative. After 6 months of serving as guardian of Shadowmere, I began to change. My eyes developed a faint luminescence that was only visible in complete darkness. My skin took on a slight translucency that allowed me to see the network of veins and nerves beneath. And my mind expanded to encompass awareness of the entire swamp ecosystem. I could sense the movement of every alligator, the migration of every bird, the growth patterns of every plant. I knew when storms were coming days before the weather service issued warnings. I could feel the deep sleeper's dreams and adjust the barriers accordingly. I was becoming something more than human, but something less than the Watchers themselves. A bridge between species, a translator between incompatible forms of consciousness. The transformation should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like coming home. My official reports to the Fish and Wildlife Service were models of bureaucratic blandness, routine maintenance, standard wildlife observations, no unusual incidents to report. I'd learned to speak the language of government agencies, to file paperwork that would discourage questions and prevent unwanted attention. Shadowmere remained officially classified as a quiet, unremarkable refuge where nothing interesting ever happened. But late at night, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin and the water reflected stars that belonged to other skies, I would take my boat out to the deepest parts of the swamp and commune with intelligences that had watched over this place since before humans evolved the capacity for language. They told me stories of the world as it had been when the continents were young, when the line between matter and energy was more suggestion than law. They showed me visions of possible futures, timelines where the deep sleeper woke and reality twisted into new configurations that would be paradise for some forms of life and hell for others. And they taught me the most important lesson of all, that guardianship was not a burden but a privilege, a chance to participate in something larger and more important than any individual existence. I've been at Shadowmere for 4 years now. The changes in my body have continued, but slowly, allowing me to adapt to each new stage of transformation. I can breathe underwater for hours at a time. My vision extends into spectrums that don't have names. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the water is perfectly still, I can see through the eyes of the Watchers themselves. The deep sleeper remains contained, its prison maintained by the combined efforts of ancient intelligences and one very changed human being. The barriers are strong, the seals intact, the balance preserved. But I know this arrangement is temporary. Someday, despite our best efforts, the deep sleeper will wake. Climate change, industrial pollution, or simple entropy will eventually weaken the barriers beyond our ability to repair them. When that day comes, I'll be ready to make the final sacrifice that guardianship demands. I'll descend to the deepest chamber and become part of the prison itself, using my transformed body and expanded consciousness to create one last seal that might contain the awakening for another few centuries. It's not a fate I fear. After 4 years of communion with the Watchers, death seems like just another kind of transformation, another step in an evolutionary process that encompasses more than just biological existence. Besides, I won't be alone. The eyes in the water will watch over me, just as I've watched over them. And somewhere in the depths of Shadowmere, in chambers that exist between dream and reality, the thing that sleeps will continue sleeping, contained by barriers maintained by love, sacrifice, and the eternal vigilance of those who understand that some powers are too vast for any single world to contain. The Watchers chose well when they selected me as their human guardian. I only hope my successor, when the time comes, will prove equally worthy of their trust. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been patrolling these woods for 7 years. 7 years of listening to campers' ghost stories, of finding lost hikers, of watching over 50,000 acres of dense pine and oak that stretch across the Montana wilderness. 7 years of thinking I knew every sound these woods could make. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of night when the temperature drops fast and the fog rolls in like a living thing. I was finishing my evening patrol, checking the locks on the bear boxes near Sunset Campground, when I heard it for the first time. A whistle, clear and melodic, echoing through the trees from somewhere deep in the forest. At first, I figured it was just a camper trying to call their dog back to camp. Happens all the time. But as I listened, something about the sound made my skin crawl. It was too perfect, too practiced. Like someone who'd been whistling the same tune for decades. I radioed back to the station. "Base, this is Webb. Anyone report a missing pet in Sector 7? Static crackled back. "Negative, Webb. All campers accounted for. Everything okay out there?" I listened again. The whistling had stopped. "Yeah, probably just an owl or something. Heading back now." But as I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the treeline. Every shadow seemed to move, every branch looked like reaching fingers. By the time I got home to my cabin on the edge of the park, my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The next night, I heard it again. Same time, same haunting melody, but closer this time. Much closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the ranger station where I'd been doing paperwork. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of picnic tables and trail markers. But beyond that circle of light, the forest pressed in like a wall of black water. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Park Ranger Webb. If someone's out there, you need to return to your campsite. The park closes at sunset." The whistling stopped abruptly, as if I'd interrupted something important. Then, after a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever, I heard footsteps. Not the heavy boots of a hiker or the shuffling gait of someone lost in the dark. These were light, deliberate steps, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The steps circled my position, staying just outside the reach of my flashlight. I spun around, trying to track the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My radio crackled with static, and when I tried to call for backup, all I got was white noise. Then the steps stopped, and I heard breathing. Slow, measured breaths that sounded wrong somehow, like air being forced through damaged lungs. I backed toward the station, my hand finding the grip of my service weapon. "I'm armed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Step into the light and identify yourself." The response wasn't words. It was laughter, low and wet, that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. Then the whistling started again, that same haunting melody, but now it was coming from directly behind me. I spun around and saw nothing but darkness. When I finally made it back inside the station and locked the door, I sat at my desk with shaking hands and tried to write up an incident report. But what could I say? That I'd been spooked by sounds in the woods? That something was out there, circling like a predator? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whistle, that laughter. And in the morning, when I went outside to inspect the area around the station, I found footprints in the soft earth. Bare feet, with toes that seemed too long and nails that had gouged deep marks in the dirt. The third night, I was ready. I'd spent the day researching the history of Blackwood Forest, digging through old newspaper archives and talking to the tribal council from the nearby reservation. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1952, a man named Eugene Holloway had gone missing in these woods. He'd been a drifter, the kind of person who lived rough and traveled light. According to the police reports, searchers had found his camp near what was now Sector 7, but Holloway himself had vanished without a trace. The interesting part was what the search teams had reported hearing during their 5-day hunt for the missing man. Whistling. Always at night, always the same melody, always just out of reach. The searches had been called off after 2 of the volunteers claimed they'd been followed by something in the darkness. But that wasn't the end of Eugene Holloway's story. Over the next 20 years, there had been other disappearances in Blackwood Forest. Hikers, campers, even other park rangers. All of them had vanished without a trace, and in every case, witnesses reported hearing whistling in the days leading up to the disappearance. The tribal elder I spoke with, a weathered man named Joseph Crow Feather, had been more direct than the newspaper reports. "Some things don't stay buried in these woods," he'd told me, his dark eyes serious. "Some things get hungry and learn to hunt. Your friend Eugene, he's been calling for company for a long time." I'd asked him what he meant, but the old man had just shaken his head. "You hear the whistle, you don't follow. You hear the whistle, you run." Too bad I'd already heard it 3 times. That night, I positioned myself at the edge of Sector 7, armed with my sidearm, a shotgun, and enough equipment to contact the outside world if things went bad. I'd also brought something else, a digital recorder. If I was going crazy, at least I'd have proof. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:47 p.m., the whistling started. That same melody, hauntingly beautiful and utterly wrong. But this time, I was ready for it. I turned on the recorder and followed the sound. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that crunched under my boots as I moved deeper into the woods. My flashlight beam danced ahead of me, illuminating pine trees that seemed to loom taller than they should, casting shadows that moved independently of the light. The whistling continued, always staying about 50 yards ahead of me, leading me deeper into parts of the forest I'd never patrolled. The trees grew closer together here, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the stars. The air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something sweet and sick, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. After what felt like hours of walking, I emerged into a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood the ruins of an old cabin, its roof collapsed and walls covered in moss and vine. But it wasn't the cabin that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the trees around the clearing. Every single one of them was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the bark that formed crude letters and symbols. As I played my flashlight over them, I could make out words: help, lost, cold, hungry. And carved deeper than all the rest, in letters that must have taken days to complete, Eugene Holloway 1952. The whistling had stopped. I stood in the center of the clearing, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slowly turned in a circle. The beam of my flashlight revealed more details I wished I hadn't seen. Bones scattered around the base of the trees, most of them animal, but some that looked disturbingly human. Scraps of fabric caught on branches. And there, hanging from a low branch like some kind of grisly wind chime, a collection of metal objects: belt buckles, wedding rings, park ranger badges. One of the badges belonged to Tom Morrison, who disappeared from Blackwood Forest in 1987. That's when I heard the breathing again. Slow, labored, and very close. I spun around and saw him. Eugene Holloway stood at the edge of the clearing, and he was nothing like the missing person photo I'd found in the newspaper archives. 70 years in the woods had changed him into something that might have once been human. His skin was the color of tree bark, mottled and rough, with patches of moss growing across his shoulders and arms. His hair had grown long and wild, filled with twigs and leaves. But it was his eyes that made me take a step back. They reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's, glowing with a pale, hungry light. And his fingernails. Christ, his fingernails had grown into claws, black and sharp and caked with decades of dirt and blood. He smiled at me, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. Finally, he said, his voice like wind through dead leaves. Finally, someone who follows the music. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like being in a nightmare where your body won't respond to your brain's commands. Eugene stepped closer, and I could see that his feet were bare and split, adapted for gripping tree bark and rocky ground. "Do you know how long it's been since I had company?" he asked, tilting his head with predatory curiosity. "How long since someone heard my song and came to visit?" I managed to find my voice. "What happened to you?" Eugene laughed, that same wet sound I'd heard the night before. "I got lost. So very lost. And when you're lost in these woods long enough, when you're hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough, the forest teaches you how to survive. How to hunt. How to call prey with just the right song." He raised one clawed hand and whistled, that haunting melody that had drawn me into the woods. As the notes hung in the air, I felt something respond inside my chest, a compulsion to step closer, to listen more carefully. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Eugene said. "The song the trees taught me. They whispered it to me during that first winter, when I was dying of exposure and starvation. They told me that if I learned their music, if I made it mine, I'd never be hungry again." I fought against the compulsion and managed to take a step backward. Eugene's smile widened. "Oh, you're strong. That's good. The strong ones last longer. They make better music when they join the choir." That's when I noticed the other sounds. Soft voices coming from the trees around the clearing, humming in harmony with Eugene's whistle. I looked up and saw them, the missing people, the ones who'd been drawn by the song over the decades. They hung from the branches like fruit, their bodies twisted and changed by years in the forest, their mouths open in an endless, wordless song. Tom Morrison was there, his park ranger uniform now grown into his bark-like skin. A woman in hiking boots whose face I recognized from a missing person poster in the station. A dozen others, maybe more, all of them singing that beautiful, terrible melody. "Welcome to the choir," Eugene said, and lunged for me. I finally managed to move, throwing myself to the side as his claws raked the air where my head had been. I rolled, came up running, and crashed through the undergrowth back toward the main trail. Behind me, the singing grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear Eugene laughing as he gave chase. The forest seemed to fight me as I ran. Branches grabbed at my clothes, roots tried to trip me, and the undergrowth grew thicker with every step. But I'd been running these trails for 7 years, and I knew them better than anything that had learned to hunt here. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the state police barracks in town. They listened to my story with the kind of polite skepticism you'd expect, but they agreed to send a team out to investigate the clearing I described. They never found it. For 3 days, search teams combed Sector 7, looking for the ruined cabin and the trees covered in carvings. They found nothing but pristine forest, as if the clearing had never existed at all. But I know what I saw. And I have proof. The digital recorder I'd brought with me captured everything: the whistling, Eugene's voice, the singing from the trees. When I played it back for the investigators, all they heard was static and the sound of wind through branches. But late at night, when I'm alone in my cabin on the edge of Blackwood Forest, I can still hear the real recording. I can hear Eugene's laughter, the harmony of the missing choir, and underneath it all, that beautiful, terrible song that wants to draw me back into the woods. I put in for a transfer the next week. My supervisor approved it without question. Apparently, I'm not the first ranger to request a move away from Blackwood Forest after reporting unusual incidents in Sector 7. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Before I left, I did one more patrol of the area where I'd heard the whistling. And there, carved fresh into the bark of a pine tree just off the main trail, were new words. Marcus Webb, Ranger, 2023, heard the song will return. I've been at my new posting in Glacier National Park for 3 months now. The mountains are beautiful, the work is rewarding, and I sleep through the night without hearing voices in the wind. But sometimes, when I'm doing evening patrol and the sun is setting behind the peaks, I catch myself humming a tune I can't quite remember learning. A haunting melody that seems to echo in the spaces between heartbeats. And when that happens, I hear Eugene Holloway's voice, carried on the mountain wind from 1,000 miles away. The song never leaves you, Marcus. And neither do I. I know he's right. I can feel it growing stronger every day, that compulsion to return to Blackwood Forest, to find that clearing that may or may not exist, to join the choir that sings in the branches. The forest taught Eugene how to hunt. And now, through me, it's learning how to spread. Last week, 3 hikers went missing from Glacier National Park. The search teams found their camp abandoned, their supplies scattered, but no sign of the hikers themselves. What they did find were reports from other campers about hearing whistling in the night. That same haunting melody, echoing through the mountain valleys. I haven't reported it yet. How can I? How do you tell people that you might be the reason something evil is spreading from forest to forest, park to park? But I know I have to do something. Because every night, the song gets a little stronger, a little more insistent. And every morning, I find myself humming along. Eugene Holloway spent 70 years learning how to hunt in Blackwood Forest. And now, He's teaching me. The worst part isn't the fear or the guilt or the knowledge that I'm becoming something I don't understand. The worst part is that I'm starting to like the song.